Procedures, declaring your interest and mobile phones, switching off, and also your tablet devices can be put on mute. I will do that by pressing the F9 key followed by the F8 key. Members, today's business, 3 briefings on the local government bill. From research and then from the Belfast City Council, as well as departmental response on the issues raised by various stakeholders. We have apologies from Barry McAduff and Auburn McGuinness. Members are aware of any other apologies? Yes, Ian? Cahill Boylan. Yep. Thank you. Chairperson's business at item number 2. We have one tabled paper I wish to draw to your attention. Colum Delaney of RSBP has sent in an email to invite us for a photo shoot after the committee meeting to promote their weekend of Big Garden Bird Watch. So it would be good if some members can come out with me. Just outside. Today now, just after the meeting. Okay. Today. Yep, we'll go outside. Yep. Well, depending on what weather's like. If it's heavy rain now, I think just.
I think my understanding is due to be reasonably dry today. I think tomorrow's supposed to be bad.
Okay.
It's going to be cold today, but not.
Yeah, we'll take our big overcoat with us, but it would be nice to be outside to take the photos. If we could find a few birds as well, it would be lovely, wouldn't it? Yeah. Okay. So, members, then also just another item of chairperson's business is that Sheila and I met with the Institute of Archaeologists Ireland regarding archives in Northern Ireland. So there's a paper there for members at page 5. They certainly reiterate what they said in the letter to us. There's a huge now load of some 1.4 pieces of artifacts stored now, kind of private storage by archaeologists. When developers have to dig out kind of artifacts and before they can build anything. So they're saying there's also a lack of consistency in cataloguing and archiving these items, and there is a big need, an urgent need, for dedicated storage facilities under the care of qualified conservators, and maybe NIE can, look into this and take the lead in doing something. So I know that these issues were raised previously with us when the Cow Committee, met with us, and we had a joint meeting as well on this issue with the Cow Committee. So, members, are you content if we forward the letter to the department for the comment, and if we can check too with the Cow Committee whether they have received a similar letter? If they haven't, we'll forward the letter to them. The letter is quite detailed in their concerns. So, is that okay? Members content with that? Yeah. Yeah, or any comments about this, members? No?
He's just waving his knife, I think. Okay.
Who's waving his knife? Peter's always waving his knife. I see him licking his knife. That worries me sometimes.
Chair, if you can see me licking my knife, then it's in vision. You don't need to worry.
Have you a point to make, or just
No.
You habitual waving of the knife?
It's your coincidental.
Okay, we moved on then. Draft minutes, members, at page 9. Members content with the minutes? Okay, and then item 4, matters arising. First item is at pages 14 to 160. Members, thank goodness we're not having now paper files. There will be so much paper being used. So that item is on further information from Community Places. Members' room, if you remember, the Community Places came to us at the session on the 9th of January. They have now provided further information on the use of the general power of competence and examples of community planning in other jurisdictions. It's quite interesting. It's quite a bulky pack of information, but it certainly will help us when we decide to, maybe to visit other jurisdictions and look at good, examples, good practice, if we were going for a visit. So, okay, members, you content to note? Okay, next item is at page 161, and that's departmental update on noise action plans. Another big bulky document for members there. That's at page 161. The Minister has now adopted the Round 2 noise action plans for roads and railways and approved the George Best Belfast City Airport plan, and they're attached at Annex A, B and C. Certainly, members, don't know whether you have read through it. It's kind of quite a lot of technical details there, but certainly, I think of particular interest to the committee maybe would be the Belfast City Airport. So it's at page 226, and about the planning, they mentioned the planning agreement there too, from the George Best Belfast City Airport Zone Action Plan, and that's at page 238. So I think at some stage in the future we are meeting departmental officials about the planning agreement anyway, so that will be useful background information. Okay, members, content to note? Any comments? No? Okay. Right. Next item at page 375. That's the Examiner of Statutory Rules advice on the delegated powers of the Local Government Bill. The Examiner states that for the most part the powers seem to be appropriate and subject to an appropriate degree of Assembly control. However, the Examiner draws attention to 3 powers. That's clauses 51(5) and 54(2) relating to exam information in Part 8, and clause 85 relating to the general power of competence in Part 11. The Examiner feels these powers need to be subject to the draft affirmative procedure rather than negative resolution. And in the case of clause 85, it should be subject to a super affirmative procedure. Apparently, super affirmative procedure involves enhanced consultation on a proposed draft order, followed then by a further laying of the draft order itself, specifying any changes made since it was originally laid. So the Examiner has provided further details in his email on page 378 to Sheila. So, members, have you any comments on this, or if you're content to note, and we can maybe ask the departmental officials who are coming later on this morning about this? Okay, members, content with that? Yep. And also at there's a table paper 2 at 4.4, and that's in relation to a EU directive, and the department just alerts us that they are putting out a consultation starting from tomorrow on enhanced child restraint system on motor vehicles. Members, are you content to note, and we ask for a copy of the synopsis of responses? Okay, thank you. Then item number 5 at page 381, we have the Assembly Research Briefing on Local Government Bill research papers there. We have a number of papers, and Susie is coming in to talk to us on them. The first one is on page 381, on the Statement of Ambition in Scotland. Then at page 387, disqualification of council staff from becoming councillors. And then at page 390, that's complaint procedure on councillor conduct in other jurisdiction. And then at page 395, as an email regarding duties on ministers rather than departments in Northern Ireland. Susie, thank you very much for providing us with four additional papers. So if you can maybe talk us through the main points. I'm sure members have read through the paper there.
Okay.
Thank you.
This morning there's 3 areas that I'm going to just go through. The papers that I provided are quite brief, so hopefully it shouldn't take too long to go through. The first one is in relation to the status of the Statement of Ambition in Scotland, for which I think there's a copy in your packs. Now, this isn't a statutory document. It was published by the Scottish Government and the Commission of Scottish Local Authorities. Now, it sets out shared aspirations for community planning and how the existing framework through the community planning partnerships and single outcome agreements needs to change in order to meet the aspirations suggested in the statement. It has been suggested that, of course, some of the recommendations will require legislation. Just then to move on to the conduct of councillors. Members asked for more information on the remit and appeals process against a complaint made on councillor conduct, particularly focusing on Wales. Now, in the bill in the paper, I briefly looked at the localism bill in England as well. Now, the remit, both in England and Wales, covers members and co-opted members. However, there is no indication in the Welsh legislation that co-opted members include non-elected members. This is not the case in England, where a co-opted member includes a person who is not elected but is a voting member of a committee. Now, the definition of this is given on page 4 of the paper. In relation to appeals, Wales, for appeals that are against lower level complaints, these are dealt with by the local authorities, by Local Authority Standards Committee. And these can be made to the adjudication panel of Wales. However, appeals regarding decisions made by the Ombudsman in relation to councillor conduct and higher level complaints are to be made in writing directly to the Ombudsman's office. These are dealt with by a senior member of staff. However, should a complainant not be satisfied with their decision, the Ombudsman will personally consider the appeal. On this occasion, the Ombudsman's decision is final, so there is no appeal against the final decision of the Ombudsman, but it can be reviewed on the basis of new information. In England, the Localism Act does not make reference to any right of appeal for a complainant or a member against a decision made by the local authority's monitoring officer or standards committee. However, if it is felt the authority has failed procedurally to deal with the complaint properly, then a complaint can be made to the local government ombudsman. Now, I'm just going to move on to paper on the disqualification of council employees running as councillors. At the last briefing, members requested information just to clarify the situation in relation to the exemption of council staff becoming councillors. Now, the Northern Ireland Local Government Act 1972 introduced a blanket ban on any person who holds paid office or other place of profit in that or any other council from being elected councillor. In England and Wales, they also introduced arrangements in the 1972 in their own Local Government Act. However, this applied less strict disqualifications for council employees. The 1972 Act only disqualifies council employees from becoming councillors in the councils in which they are employed, but not other council areas. Then in 1989, the Local Government and Housing Act introduced a prohibition on council officers who hold politically sensitive posts in engaging in any political activity and standing for elected office. Now, these posts may include head of the authority's paid service, statutory and non-statutory chief officers, deputy chief officers and monitoring officers. Sections 3 and 4 of the Act outlines further criteria that could class a person as being in a politically sensitive post based largely on salary and role. Now, in 1989, a challenge to the Local Government and Housing Act was brought to the European Court of Human Rights. In 1998, on the 89 Act, a case was brought to the European Court of Human Rights. The petitioners all held politically sensitive posts and felt that the requirement was an interference with their rights for free elections and the rights of freedom of expression, assembly and political participation. However, the case was not won, and the court ruled in favour of the restriction on those holding politically sensitive posts, based on the pursuit of impartiality for senior officers. So in essence, the legislation has not changed, and the provisions under the 1989 Act in relation to employees with politically sensitive posts still stand. So yes, if anybody has any further questions or any other areas that they would like me to discuss.
Okay. A couple of things I want to. That's still just a lot of confusion over the disqualifications. Really.
Yes, and just to clarify, the case was taken in 1998, and it was in relation to the 1989 Act. So yes, it can get a bit confusing between the dates.
But we have also heard, I think, more recent to that, to 1998, there were other cases, other challenges in relation to this Act. So, I mean, which is the most recent one that determines the proposed changes in using the Local Government Act or Local Government Bill?
In relation to challenges on senior officers, this would have been the most...
Not particularly senior officers, it's just like it's against whatever human rights convention or something, that if we don't allow employees to become councillors. It was something like in 2005. That's, I just had a quick look this morning. There's the table paper from departmental officials at your table paper 13. I suppose we'll leave that maybe to ask Julie and Linda later on.
Yes,
it cited a case in July 2005.
Yes, that's the that's for voting rights of prisoners.
Okay. But previously I think departmental officials have cited more recent cases or challenges that could provide problems, and hence I think that's the reason why we are changing this. Is my memory right? Julie's nodding her head.
I appreciate all the officials. I mean, if there's a specific case, because I think one of the bits of confusion around this, because even whenever we'd met with some of the NILGA officials, they had made reference to a particular case which seemed quite a while ago. There's reference to this case, there's reference in the papers, which you're right in terms of seems to talk actually about a case principally focusing in on voting rights, which is a different thing. May be helpful, I don't know, if the officials could actually give us the citation of the case, and that maybe could be fed in so that we could actually then see direct reference to the particular case. And sort of.
And Peter, you want to come in there?
Well, it was, I suppose it was less directly in that aspect. I just wondered on the aspect of the code of conduct with the challenges and the appeals mechanism side of it. In terms of, obviously, it indicated, essentially in England there isn't really an appeal mechanism. In Wales, it seems to be probably a slightly odd thing that at one level, it seemed to be like one person out of the Ombudsman's office clearly deals with the initial complaint if it's regarded as serious enough. Yes. And then the appeal mechanism, the final appeal, is to somebody else in the Ombudsman's office, which seems to be a little bit of an odd arrangement. In terms of either England or Wales, on the basis of where these sort of breaches of code of conduct, do we know sort of what the level of potential sanctions that are available there? Because if it's a question of here's a relatively, shall we say, light touch appeals mechanism where the actual sanctions are relatively low, might be one thing. If it's a question that there have been circumstances where, for instance, a councillor has been disqualified from being on the council or suspended from the council on it, you know, the greater gravitas, the level of sanction, I think the stronger the case there is for sort of an appeals mechanism. Do we know sort of in terms of the powers of, I mean, maybe that's something...
It's something I could certainly look into, yes.
Okay.
I mean, it would appear that ultimately for other jurisdiction it is still using judicial review as the appeal mechanism, as the last resort. Is that right for Wales and Scotland, where
they don't have the same form of appeals? Sorry?
Yeah, where they don't have, yes, or the appeal is still within the Ombudsman's office. But I think the Ombudsman came to us. They were saying it wasn't just as simple as dishing out the sanction or their judgment. There's a bit of communication with the councillor, and the councillor can bring legal representation. So, I mean, in some ways, I mean, it's more or less like in Wales. You have one complaint officer dealing with the case, making the judgment, and if someone's not satisfied with it, then can bring it back and then talk with another. So, anyway. So, Tom, you want to come in?
Chair, it was really around the restriction on the employees being standing for election for councillors, but don't think we can progress that much until we hear from the officials, probably.
Right. Well, thank you, Susie.
There was one more area in relation to, I think it was Community Places had brought it up, on the duty for community planning placed on the department, and they had mentioned in Scotland that it's placed on ministers. Now, I've had a very brief discussion with legal services, and in fact it doesn't seem to be just as clear cut as I had hoped. So it may warrant legal advice on that if you do wish to take that further. It's just beyond my remit.
Okay. The Community Places suggests that instead of departmental officials, we bring in the duty, on the minister rather than the department. Is that? Yeah. But your paper is saying it's not that simple. You can't do that.
Basically, yes.
Okay, radio.
Do you want to pursue this?
Members, do you want to pursue this? And legal advice will be from legal
from the assembly.
From the assembly. Yeah, I think so. Members, happy for Susie to pursue that? Okay. Yep. Thank you.
It's also
We pursue it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, members, then we then moved on to the next item. Members, at page 397.
They're not here yet.
Oh, they're not here yet. Okay, we're moving on very quickly today. Members, then maybe I don't want to jump to talking to officials yet, because we want to allow quite a bit of time, and maybe also to talk to the councils first. So if we moved on to the next item to deal with correspondence, are they here now? Okay, lovely. Okay. Members, then you have in your pack there at page 397 the Belfast City Council's written submission. Okay, members, at 397 there. A very detailed submission from them, and we're going to have... Hello, good morning, Peter. Good to see you.
Fine. Lovely place you have.
We're moving.
It's really a sad thing when you're struggling to find your glasses.
We are moving fairly quickly today, so probably you didn't expect to be this quick.
No, we're delighted.
Okay.
We're delighted to have the opportunity
Yep.
to hear before you, Mark. Delighted
Are you bringing
that,
the food team?
You're being expeditious in your business.
Yes, it's great.
Morning.
Great to be moving fast with the business, so that means we can have more time to be speaking with you. So you're very welcome, Chief Executive of Belfast City Council, Peter McNally, Ronan Gregan, Director of Finance, John Walsh, Town Solicitor, Stephen McQuarrie, Democratic Services Manager. What does that mean, Democratic Services Manager?
I've yet to find out.
Okay, members, just to remind everyone, this session will be or is being recorded by Hansard. Okay, Peter and your team, thank you very much for coming. You're very welcome. We certainly have your written submission, very detailed written submissions, and we appreciate that. But if you can just give us about 5 minutes, a quick run through of the main points, and then to take questions from members afterwards.
Delighted to do that, Madam Chairman. And thank you very much once again for the opportunity to provide a briefing. We know that you're working very hard, and we've read some of the transcripts in Hansard of other submissions. And I'm going to keep this quite brief and just focus on some of the key issues insofar as we believe them to be relevant. I would say at the outset, it does seem to me that, to be fair to the Department for Environment, they've worked very hard in putting this bill together, and I've been in local government for 30 years, and certainly this is the most comprehensive piece of legislation in local government that I've seen, so we do appreciate it's a hard job for everybody. So, obviously, we would start off by saying we're here on behalf of the Council, and the Council would want us to emphasise how supportive they are of the Local Government Reform Programme and their commitment to working with partners to make sure that it is successful. One point I would make is that Belfast is slightly different in local government reform in that it isn't merging with other councils. It is increasing its size to take in parts of Lisburn and Castlereagh. That has a consequence for the transfer of liabilities, and John Walsh is here and will say something about that at the end. But we think, just to deal with a small technical point, there should be a standard rule about the transfer of assets and liabilities, so that what happens down the line. I was a lawyer in a previous life, and what happens is, like 30 years later, after 1972, we were still dealing with transfer of liabilities and assets issues. So I think having a standard rule in the legislation sometimes is very helpful because it takes away any doubt. We do make submissions in relation to call-in and qualified majority voting. We do understand that this is a political decision. We obviously support the broad principle of call-in being available, but we do have concerns that the current broad definition of the two circumstances in which call-in would apply, that is, when a decision has not been arrived at after proper consideration of relevant facts and issues, or when the decision would disproportionately adversely affect any section of the inhabitants of the district, are so broad that an interpretation of them could lead to a very high percentage of decisions being subject to call-in. Obviously, these things will play themselves out through councils, but clearly one of the most important issues is to continue to make decisions and provide services to the public. And actually having a process which makes it, which logs John's decisions, I think, is a matter that the committee may wish to consider. Obviously, in qualified majority voting, we would make the general point. Obviously, for years, local government has operated on a simple majority. Whilst we understand that the reasons why that might be changed, we do think that the potential for unnecessary tensions and delays in the decision-making process needs to be considered fully. Community planning, very quickly, very supportive of the issue of community planning, that local authorities lead and facilitate community planning. Clearly, we're of the view that the provisions about community planning could be somewhat strengthened in the sense that there is not a statutory duty on departments. Whilst we understand that departments deliver through agencies and bodies, if we're all going to take community planning seriously, perhaps a duty they should do more than promote and encourage it, and there should be a duty to implement it. I'm going to move on to performance improvement. Now, before everyone's eyes glaze over, I cannot tell you how important the performance improvement processes will be to the actual proper implementation of and the success of something like community planning. My experience would tell me that a proper performance improvement system and a proper performance management system actually drives the resources and the direction of not just the Council but other organisations towards the purpose you want to achieve. So, for instance, if you take community planning is about the integration of resources to prioritised actions that the community and the other statutory bodies and delivery agencies have agreed, whether it is health and equity, whether it's employability, whether it's action on youth unemployment. But unless you actually direct and align the actual focus of resources, then you're really just talking about it. And the research into community planning from Scotland and Wales and England demonstrate that the more effective the performance management system to drive that, then the more effective actually community planning is. I caution just at the outset, there is an obsession in community planning about the achievement of outcomes. And of course, outcomes are critical, but outcomes are always long-term. So, for instance, if you have an outcome in a city like Belfast, which has high levels of health inequity, if you have an outcome to reduce the mortality rate of males, and of course, Madam Chairman, you realise that in Belfast, males die on average at the age of 77. Women, of course, who have a much easier life live on until they're 82. That was a jest, but the point about health inequity is if you have a target to reduce the mortality rate, you're not going to be able to tell whether you're having any effect on that unless it's over 10 years. So an outcome isn't enough. You have to have a process, you have to have an input, you have to have some sort of output in the meantime, and you have to have an aligned, integrated plan, because the Council resources will be nowhere enough to do that. You will need social services, you will need housing executive, you will need a whole range of other bodies. So when you actually look at the bill, the only people that the auditor is going to audit in terms of community planning is the Council. And if it's about integrated services, then that seems to be a bit of a gap. You're going to have effective audit of the effectiveness of the community plan, which means that you need to look at the inputs and processes of the other people who contribute to it. And that's the real issue I want to make about performance improvement. We made a submission, we put in a submission from a chap called Clive Grace, who used to be the Audit Commissioner for Wales. They have done a whole piece of research, really good stuff, in my view, good stuff that sets out the broad principles of a performance improvement system. And I think that should be built in either to the bill itself or at least a direction that it is picked up in the development of guidance for. And it really says, without going through it, it really says that you cannot focus just on outcomes. You have to have other intermediate measures. You have to have clear and concise targets that need to be spread across the bodies. You need to have a standard set of measures that's driven, and you need to have local organisational indicators. So the improvement objectives are set out at clause 88. The only other issue I would make, and again this comes from managing an organisation, at present councils are driven by the local, the best value bill that requires us to perform our functions having regard to a combination of economy, efficiency and effectiveness. And I understand that, and we can advise councils about it. We are now going to have to, in the future, drive our functions in terms of strategic effectiveness, service quality, service availability, fairness, sustainability, efficiency and innovation. Now, I would draw your attention to one critical thing. You don't have the word economy in that. Now, the word economy means making the best use of resources. And it is different, in my view, than efficiency. Efficiency means that whatever resources you put in, you get the most out of. But economy means that you actually use the least amount of resources that you need to use for, to achieve the outcome. And I would say that there is a balance between economy, efficiency and effectiveness. And I would also say, if you looked at the definition of value for money, the National Audit Office have a definition of value for money. It's defined on the basis of a mixture of economy, efficiency and effectiveness. And I do think that it's something that is worthy of some consideration by the committee and taking advice from others. I think it's a gap. And I think that affordability is a critical issue, particularly in councils where the prime driver is the rate. That's the thing that that you'll have the biggest conversation on. So very quickly then, performance indicators. and the role of the local government auditor. I've dealt with performance indicators. The role of local government auditor. I am a bit troubled by clause 97. Now, I saw when the audit, Louise Mason was up, she also mentioned the crystal ball gazing clause. I think it's very difficult to guess whether somebody complies with their responsibility, particularly when you are then going to look at the delivery of the responsibility. And I agree with the auditor that if you're minded to keep that clause in, and personally I see no value in the clause, I don't understand why you would guess whether someone would comply when you're going to look at whether they comply or not. But if you're going to keep it in, then it's something that should be done as you're looking at whether or not a body has the capacity to deliver that clause. We would also be slightly conscious that in a council it is the elected members who have the democratic mandate to set the priority and the delivery against the priority. And the right balance needs to be struck, that elected members have that primacy and that it's not overcome by audit. Ultimately, audit need to look at the process and whether what you do actually has the effect that you say it has. But in terms of priorities, I think democratic legitimacy needs to be paramount. And our members are very strong in that, and they've asked me to stress to you the importance of you taking that into your consideration, and clearly, as democratic members, you will. Finally, we leave you with the alternative in terms of the piece of work that we commissioned from Clive Grace. We shared that with government departments, and we asked them to consider the critical issue, which is the alignment of local government delivery through the community plan with the priorities set out in the programme for government. If there is alignment in terms of youth unemployment, if there's alignment in terms of regeneration, if there's alignment in terms of poor health, then the ability to deliver on local priorities and the ability for that to tap into the resource priorities of departments is much enhanced. Without that alignment, you will get confusion, you will get tension, and you will get, in my view, unnecessary obstacles being put in place. So, look, I don't want to add a great deal more than to say that we think that there is, boring as it might seem, there is a real criticality in ensuring that we have an aligned system, that we have an integrated system, that we have an audited system that affects across the body, across all the bodies involved, and finally, that enough resources and capacity are put into that, which in my view should just not be an investment in audit. It needs to be also investment in the capacity of the sector, and the sector needs to take responsibility. And I conclude by thanking you for the opportunity to make this submission, and we're happy, if we can add any value to your questions, we're happy to try to do that.
Thank you very much, Peter. As usual, very succinct but very, very clear. I reread your written submission, read it first time you sent it in, so I think it makes a lot of sense. And thank you very much for reminding us of Dr. Clive Grace as well. We certainly are hoping to either meet with him or bring him over to talk to us. Yeah, I know you've done a lot of work with him. And again, I think the outcome approach is very good management speak, but really it's a very, very long-term process. It is very difficult to evaluate, and it should be on a long-term, really evaluation purpose rather than immediate performance indicators. So anyway, I did all that in my Masters in Management about 10 years ago. You remind me of my lectures. So you mentioned about capacity building a few times in your written submission, and you just remind us again. In what structure would you see that? Who is going to take it? What needs to be put in?
Well, there's a whole history to performance improvement across local government. Different approaches have been taken in England, Scotland, Wales. Obviously, in Northern Ireland, we've had a local government which has much fewer functions and a much smaller size. In England, they set up a body called the Improvement and Development Agency for Local Government, which is now incorporated within the Local Government Association, and that was driven by the sector approach, which mentored and added capacity and brought expertise to councils to improve. And I think that's one approach. Wales have taken the approach of no direct top-down driven accountability, although they just, and again, the committee, they've just published this report, Commission on the Public Service Governance Delivery Summary Report in January 2014, which got some publicity, and which is a review of the delivery of public services in Wales. Very bravely, it says that the quality of public services in Wales is patchy and poor. And it then goes on to make some real recommendations. In my obsession with performance and performance management, there's a whole chapter in this about how they might more properly and better integrate services. In Wales, they set up things called local services boards to drive community planning, and then they had audit overseeing the local services boards. This recommends that that's discontinued, in the sense that it became too mechanistic and it became driven by process rather than by achievement of better social outcomes and benefits. England had before the Improvement Development Agency, they had a very top-down, legislative-driven process through a thing called comprehensive performance assessment that was driven by audit inspection. And Scotland have a sort of like in-between system where they have partial regulation and partial self-help. I think personally that's the best. I think, of course, councils should be encouraged to improve internally, but I think they should also have the spectre of external challenge and being held to account. And I think that push-pull system is probably the best.
Yeah, and they need to have ownership of it as well. Okay, Peter, you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Peter, for the. Certainly looking through the submission that's been made by Belfast City Council, I agree with the bulk of what's there, not absolutely everything, and certainly everything you've said today. Actually, I would fully endorse in that regard. Can I just probe you a little bit in details and get your thoughts on? You've raised concerns, which I think, in terms of application, is going to be a crucial area on the qualified majority vote, and particularly, I suppose, linked in with that, what either is an automatic or indeed the circumstances in which counts as a legitimate call-in. And I suppose there's two aspects to that I want to get your views on. First of all, in terms of the determination, however it is worded, because it seems to be in terms of the call-in, there's two headings. There's more or less, if you like, procedural irregularities on it. I'd also, suppose, caveat this by saying that whatever mechanism is there, we need something that, if there is any level of challenge, that is dealt with pretty quickly, so that it doesn't in and of itself become simply a delaying mechanism. But the sort of the procedural side of things is probably relatively straightforward. I suppose the key focus is the interpretation of what counts as a legitimate call-in on the grounds of essentially sort of breach of community balance or community, disproportionate impact on that side of things. Now, leaving aside, first of all, the direct definition of that, which we'll come to in a moment, at present the legislation then has the testing mechanism of that being that the Chief Executive or Town Clerk simply refers that to a solicitor, or sorry, to I suppose solicitor or barrister, I can't remember the exact one, words, and gets an opinion just in that regard. Now that seems to me quite a loose concept, and indeed, depending upon, as you say, Peter, both of us being former lawyers in that regard, depending on which lawyer you get, you sometimes can get different interpretations. I just wonder your views on that, whether you have any sort of thoughts, because whatever way there is for call-in, there's got to be some level of test of the legitimacy of that, as to what your thoughts on that as a mechanism for testing out that, and if you believe that's not necessarily the best format at present, what you would see as an alternative mechanism.
Well, I agree with you totally, that depending on what lawyer you go to will very much impact upon what advice you get. I think this is
who pays for
well,
it too.
well, absolutely.
It's a bit like, Chair, it's a bit like consultants in that regard. You know?
No, absolutely. But I do think that this is something that needs to be assisted by guidance. Mm-hmm. I think this is an area where guidance needs to be given on the type of factors which would constitute a disproportionate impact. Now, of course, councils are already under statutory duty under Section 75 to promote equality, and that already will require, in many policy initiatives, an equality impact assessment to be carried out. In terms of this, I have a sort of like schizophrenic view. As a chief executive, I think you will abrogate their responsibility for advising on the management of councils by saying that every time that there is a call-in, they will go to a lawyer and seek an opinion. Ultimately, I do think that they need to have, inverted commas, responsibility to advise their council, but that should be against a consistent set of guidance which they apply objectively and which hopefully then will allow a consistent and fair administration of the council's duties. I think there is a role for lawyers, and John, who's our lawyer, is here, and there would be plenty of circumstances where, you know, we would have, for instance, we would have standing orders around notices of motion, and, you know, when Stephen receives them, he would refer to me. We would often refer those to the lawyers for comment on whether or not they comply with the conditions we have set out in the standard notice of motions. And I think that's the only real way in practice that this is going to apply. I also think that it's very difficult if all of the times you're going to an outside lawyer, because until such time as they become sufficiently cognizant of the affairs of the council and how they make decisions, then I think that could delay decision making.
As part of that, Peter, whether there is some, and whether this may not be something that could be enforced in legislation, I think if there's a test of whether something is legitimate call-in, I think ultimately the ultimate test in that has got to be probably outside the council directly. Having said that, whether or not, at least with, I think everyone would agree with the need for clear guidance in that regard, but you know, whether or not at least there's some level of encouragement of a sort of almost an informal, a very short informal arrangement for
yes.
that, you know, as I suspect a lot of these things will tend to be a case of a party from whatever side will say, well, actually, we're not happy with that decision, we're going to try and call that in, as to whether or not, shall we say, first of all, perhaps an informal approach internally to say, look, you know, what do you view sort of as whether this meets the targets, whether that there may be some merit in that, while not making that part of a formal mechanism on that basis?
Well, I mean, just to respond very quickly, and if I may bring in Stephen and John of you, I think that's right. And Stephen, you were talking to me about this yesterday. Do you want to?
Well, yes. I mean, with regard to the calling on the community impact, if you wish to say it, I mean, the figures, and we're not here to discuss the percentages. We accept that the committee and the minister has taken a view on the 15% for calling, 80% on qualified majority. In the new Belfast District Council or City Council, whenever we get the status back, that would be 9 members. And it's likely that we will have, in any projection of election results, 3 or 4 parties alone who would constitute that number. So there is no element of cross-community. And I think you're right, Mr Weir, in saying that it allows a party who don't find a decision acceptable to call it in on community impact grounds. The calling on procedural issues, you're quite right, is a little more straightforward. And really the opinion from the solicitor coming back is really only putting the decision then on to the full council in a traditional committee system on a weighted majority vote. So anything that you're calling in on community impact ends up requiring an 80% majority of the council to support it. It does have some cause for concern in Belfast, where if there's a very divisive issue, it might oftentimes not be possible to get 80% to vote for anything.
Yeah, although, Stephen, I've seen that argument. One of the things maybe I would slightly disagree with in a different sphere in it, which is, to some extent, I appreciate what the impact directly in Belfast. I would have thought the argument for it in Belfast would actually be stronger than most areas, in the sense that if the argument in a particular area might be that 25% is hostile to something, but may be able to block it, a situation where it's maybe on a 55-45 being imposed, where it's regarded as being legitimate, I think there is a stronger grounds for actually saying, you know, a particular thing shouldn't happen in that regard.
I fully understand it. It just, again, from an administrative point of view, an administrator's point of view, it does open up the possibility of just the council not taking a decision to do anything, and therefore it is a decision to do nothing on certain of those issues that are.
Can I ask, Anthony, just in terms of the definitional side on it, and again, it may be something, to be fair, throwing this at you, so, you know, maybe something you may want to follow up in writing, as to how we tie down in quite a tight manner the definition of community disadvantage, because given that that's, I mean, it seems to me that the thinking behind this very clearly from that is to essentially say, well, a decision largely in a unionist council, which would then adversely affect the nationalist community, should have some level of protection on it, and similarly where it's a nationalist council, vice versa in connection with that. I suppose the concern is, and I think some of the stuff that's come out at times from the department, where they talk about something, there's been suggestions that QMV, for instance, would be automatic, where it cuts across EEAs, for instance, automatically. That is clearly a degree of nonsense, most particularly in Belfast, that a very, very large percentage of your decisions are going to be, and that is a recipe for gridlock. And I suppose part of the thing is that we ensure that we have something that does provide a degree of protection, but doesn't then become so wide that it becomes both a blocking mechanism and used unintended, or what was originally unintended consequences. To use an example on it, as we've seen, I know in a neighbouring council, whenever they looked at the issue, they felt that, for instance, that down the years there had been, say, too many sort of very small play parks put round an area, and actually what they'd be better off, and which were then very difficult to maintain, they'd actually be better with a smaller number of play parks that were much more modern and larger. Take that as an example. Now, if you apply that to Belfast or anywhere, presumably where we're looking at from the point of view of interpretation, if you got a council which, in, say, for the sake of argument, either rationalising its play parks or alternatively saying we want more of the play parks, if essentially policy was being driven through which, for the sake of argument, meant that overwhelmingly all the play parks were getting put in the nationalist areas, or overwhelmingly they're putting in the unionist area, that would clearly be something that there's community disadvantage. If, on the other hand, you were, as part of this, you're saying, well, actually, we're going to close 8 smaller play parks throughout the city to try and concentrate the resources on another element. And as part of that, you could then, almost certainly because of particularly the geography of Belfast and other areas would apply in a similar fashion, you could very easily point to, say, one of the play parks and say, well, that is an area which is overwhelmingly nationalist, overwhelmingly unionist. And if you take that in isolation, the decision to close that particular play park could clearly, in a very narrow interpretation, then be counted as being a sort of a community disadvantage. But you may be in a situation where you're closing 8 play parks, 4 in nationalist areas, 4 in unionist areas. That clearly is an overall policy, and actually one that's driven by what the needs overall. That would clearly be an example. So, I mean, maybe it's something, if you want to go to see where we can actually get I think what needs to be quite a tight definition of what, from the point of view of whether it's on the face of legislation or whether it's in guidance, that can actually tie this down so that it becomes a very clear cut, where people actually would see it as properly legitimate, as opposed to simply something happening in our area that we don't like. We're going to use this mechanism simply to stop whatever. Or, as sometimes the case as well, almost becomes a sort of a pork barrel type issue to say, well, actually, you see, if you're going to take something which affects our DEA, we're going to block that unless you agree to such and such and such and such other area, which is not, should not be good politics either in that regard, or to the advantage of citizens in that regard. So I don't know. I mean, rather than this, we'll maybe just get if there's any thoughts that you can put down to us on how you tie in that definition, I think that would be helpful as well.
Well, we're happy to do that. I think that's a very good example. And I think, from my experience, the key issue is that you always have to look at a decision in 2 ways. You have to look on its local impact, and you have to look on its borough or citywide or district impact. To look at something just on the impact of one of those can lead to unfairness in the other. And the issue of play parks, I think, is a good example. And I think that the solution might lie in a consideration of balancing a disproportionate impact, taking into account the overall effect it has on the overall city or borough or things. Otherwise, you could be held a hostage to fortune for it, and that is one of the problems in the continuous performative regime, which actually puts in service availability. As a manager, I'm deeply troubled by that, because that doesn't allow you to balance it with economy. So, for instance, to use your example, one of the things we're actually looking at the moment is we have 13 leisure facilities provided because of the sectarian geography or where people live in the city. They live in different places. But if we tried to rationalise that to improve the quality of service and perhaps only have 6 on a citywide basis, we would be in real trouble with the definition as presently stands. So we'll be happy maybe to offer some thoughts, and I think it's a good point.
There's also the issue around the hierarchy of decisions and that, because we would agree an overall capital programme, which hopefully would demonstrate balanced investment across the city. But you then have sub-decisions within that, such as where do the playgrounds go. So I think one of the issues is how do you, at the major decision level, setting the rate, the capital programme, is a different issue than where you put the playground. So I think there needs to be a balance about the hierarchy of decisions within that call-in as well.
Yeah, because I mean, as part of that, I mean, again, just to keep on using that analogy, you may find that you have an overall balanced picture, but for example, the specific decisions on, I was taking this because it's quite an easy one to get our heads around in terms of the play park type situation, where they may lead then arising out of that to individual decisions on particular playgrounds, which may or may not happen as a block. It might happen individually depending upon timing, and it may be. And I appreciate obviously Belfast is a situation where, generally speaking, your level of resources tend to be bigger than most councils in that regard. But for most councils, for example, if they're pursuing, say, a play park strategy, will say, well, actually, we have enough money that we can do 2 playgrounds this year and we can do 2 next year, or whatever it happens to be on that side of things. So there may well be an overall strategy which then prioritises and sequences things on it. But the individual decisions that are taken from a pure capital point of view may be such that simply they can't be just green-lighted all in the one go type of thing, and may need to be staggered on that basis. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, Peter, the departmental officials have told us, yes, they are taking on board all the comments about the call-in and the percentage and all that, and they are going to issue very clear criteria on what issues can be called in. But, I mean, is that enough? I mean, you can never have an inexhaustive, really a totally inclusive list. I mean, that's one way of maybe dealing it. But are you saying you want to lower the majority
That's not really a question for us. We're, as officers, and I think that's a political conversation, and a political balance needs to be struck. What we're saying is that in making that decision, you should have cognizance of the impact that setting it at too high a level may have on the efficient dispatch of business. If you look at the core issue, which is confidence in democracy, I mean, we've always looked at the standing in which the council is held, and that goes up and down depending on, some decisions you take and the potential impact that it has on people and how people are unhappy. But what we have found from our surveys that not taking decisions leads to a disengagement by the public, and leads to a questioning of relevancy of an organisation. And therefore, what I'm just cautioning on is, in an attempt to achieve protect against one mischief, you can actually counterbalance too much and cause a greater mischief, which is a disconnection and against the people are not satisfied that their democratic institutions are taking decisions quickly enough and in the interest of everybody. Now, I qualify everything that I said is that, of course, decisions should be made on the basis of trying to serve everybody and having due regard to the need to promote equality and access to services, and we have always, as officers, tried to advise on those lines. So I think it is a delicate balance, and I'm glad that you're making the decision rather than us.
But certainly you want to see the smooth running of the council,
yes,
and providing continuous services rather than in stalemate all the time.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. Tom, you've been very patient. Your turn, Tom.
Sure, thank you. Thanks very much for your presentation, folks. Just following on the call-in issue, would you say it would be useful if there were set criteria for all the councils in Northern Ireland, as opposed to each council making up their own criteria? I suppose particularly in the qualified majority, sorry, I should have said, because obviously that has to be built into standing orders.
I think genuinely at the start, particularly for qualified majority voting, that there should be guidance that should be consistently applied across Northern Ireland. I think, as you say, building it into the standing orders, making it a process then that's consistently applied to every decision is essential. And I just caution that people are careful on the criteria for QMV, because people have said earlier on, if you use criteria that's been suggested, like this is an issue that affects more than one DEA, then any decision. We have loads of universal services: cleansing, leisure, planning, regeneration. They will always affect more than one DEA, and potentially that means that you're going to have everything called in. There's also certain decisions that a council have to take. A council have to legislatively set a rate. You can't have QMV on setting a rate, because what's the alternative? You don't set one and you don't have any resources. Similarly, I think that there are other decisions. You know, when you actually look at the nuts and bolts of a council, my advice is follow the money, because that's actually where that has the impact on what the decisions are. So, for instance, the agreement of your capital programme. I think a capital programme must benefit all the ratepayers, but I think that you can't benefit all the ratepayers at one time. Sometimes you might have to do it over a period of 2 capital programmes over 8 years. You know, so it may be that you're doing the north of the city in the first 4, and then the east of the city in the next 4. Well, if you have the need to have 80%, then what you're going to have pork barrel politics all the time. It's going to be one for you, one for us. Now, it may be that's what you want, but that's the consequence. And therefore, I think that...
And we've seen plenty of that in action in the last 40 years.
Absolutely. So therefore, I think that the balance of consideration has to be, yes, you've determined you want QMV. You now have to, I think, balance the potential mischief that could cause by being quite specific in the circumstances that it will apply.
Okay.
On the issue of control arrangements within councils, I know that there's been suggestions around the committee style, which most councils currently use, or an executive style, which probably isn't as popular in Northern Ireland as it is in some other areas. And I'm wondering your thoughts on that, because being the biggest council in Northern Ireland, obviously you may have more opportunity to trial the executive model than others, because I sometimes think that the current council system in Northern Ireland is probably too small to use executive type systems. But anyway, I'm keen on to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, again, I encourage my colleagues to come in. We are presently doing an exercise in the council at the moment, assisted by a body called AESI, who's the Improvement Agency for the South East of England. We're doing a governance review, and they are heavily involved with our elected members, looking at the 3 potential styles of governance, which are committee, executive and scrutiny, and streamline committee. The feedback we're getting, and this will be a political choice, as you know, the feedback we're getting is that there is probably a preference coming for our elected members for a streamlined committee system, which will encourage inclusivity, that everyone's involved, but at the same time allow decisions to be made with more dispatch and quicker. Personally, in a divided community, I think inclusivity is important. I think as an officer, if I was entirely selfish, I would prefer an executive, because it means that you have a dedicated group of 8 to 10 elected members who you could go to and who could make a decision quicker and could then front that decision up in the press. But I think it is likely that our preference politically will be for a streamlined committee system. And I wouldn't knock the committee system. I think the committee system, which has stood in place in Victorian years, has many strengths. One of which is that, particularly in a council such as ours, we make decisions in committee. There's always the opportunity before it goes to full council for approval, for further political discussion, for further information to be given to refine decisions. And I think having that sort of gap in time between when you make a committee decision and you go to full council has always served us relatively well.
Would you see an executive type system having difficulty within the councillors themselves of providing a 2-tier councillor system,
yes,
whereby one set of councillors are on the executive and the rest of them may feel that they're being marginalised and not as important?
Yes, I think that would be the case. But if you look at democracy overall, is that not always the case? Is there not backbenchers? Is there not members of committees? Are there not ministers? The nature, I think there is a question to be asked. There will always have to be a differentiation in role, because even in a council in the present committee system, you will have a councillor who's just members of the committees. You'll have a party group. You'll have a chair of committee. We have party group leaders who we pay special responsibility allowance to. We have civic positions. So there is a range of positions of responsibility, and we operate in the system that our party group leaders would meet informally, and they are paid special responsibility allowance to try and discuss and try to agree matters of where there's political differences. But it's fed in. Their decisions are not formal. It's fed in through the committee system. But it's to encourage political dialogue.
But they're paid for that?
They're paid special responsibility allowance. And that's common. That's common across the UK.
But sorry, is it common in other councils?
I am unable to. I don't have that knowledge.
Well, if I could tell you the council I served on, it's not done there. But I mean, that's really, by the way, maybe other councils do it. I'm not sure.
No.
Yeah, I can confirm other councils don't do it as well. Anyway.
But there are 51 councillors in Belfast.
Yeah.
You know, so I mean, it's harder to talk to 51 individuals.
Yeah. Not different.
Chair, can I just ask about a couple of things, maybe just slightly outside the bill itself, and that is around Belfast, because as you did say, it is especially, or it's a different case, not special. It's different to other councils where there's not the same merging. Do you feel there will be not the same significant costs in the reorganisation in Belfast as there would be in other areas, or not the same amount of savings?
I am wise enough to defer to my Director of Finance and Resources.
And I mean, there are bigger opportunities, I think, for the other councils in terms of merging 3 councils together. The potential to bring, you have one system instead of 3 systems, and have one payroll system, have one finance system. Belfast has already got, through the members, an efficiency programme for the last 6 years. We have taken £18 million of pure cash out of the estimates. Well, our rates this year, last year were set at 0, and this year, tomorrow, will be set hopefully at 0 again. In real terms, that's about 5% cut, and that was done purely through the savings are cash, so they're given back to the ratepayer. But I think the big issue is not at an individual council level, is the potential for regional collaboration. So things like regional collaboration across the 11 councils. So things like common IT infrastructure, like a common network, is where the big potential is, and also in terms of the bigger procurement items. So I think the issue is going to be is how we put governance arrangements in place which would support savings at that regional level.
There's no huge onus or responsibility to carry that out at the moment, though, is there?
No, because each council sets its own rate, and the efficiency savings had to be integrated. What we have done is integrate that into the rate setting process. So, but I think when the councils come together, have a look at their new 75% of our money comes from the rate. The key driver for us was that over the last number of years, the rate base has been stagnant, so there has been no growth in the rate. And so that if you want to keep the rate low, you need to take cash out of the system.
I think there is an opportunity, and again, it's a balance, as all things normally are. The key driver in most councils is the rate and the level of the rate. You know, that's the key driver. We would receive representation all the time from businesses about, in these economically stringent times, that markets have realigned rental values, but the rates have remained the same. And we're obviously, as officers, very sympathetic to that. But the problem is that the rate is, once you have invested the rate in services, then the only way to lower the rate is to cut services, and there isn't political will to do that. I think, therefore, what you have to do is really look for the opportunity. When we did our efficiency programme, there's always 3 elements to efficiency. The first is that you can increase your income. It's not just that you cut services. You can make yourself more efficient. You can also, so we've derived a lot of efficiencies. To give an example, is we completely reconfigured our insurance procurement. So we were spending maybe £2 million a year on insurance, and a lot of that was due to our bad claims experience with our drivers and vehicles, because we have a fleet of 400 vehicles. We intensively worked with our fleet in training. We dramatically improved our rate of accidents, and in turn we did different procurement for our insurance, and we reduced our insurance figures by, I think it was £500,000. Joint procurement, I think, is critical. Belfast also has Information Services Bureau. We have 90 people in that information. We have 90 people. We sell our services to across the UK, and we provide services to councils in Wales, councils in England, many others. There are ICT services. So we design systems, and we have CRMs, customer relationship management systems, that we sell. The problem in Northern Ireland is that everybody, quite understandably, wants the services provided in their area or district. And therefore, I think that the only way forward that we will get agreement is if we get away from this issue that you have to have one for Northern Ireland, and you move to a conversation that you might have 3 sub-regional centres. So you might have one in Enniskillen, you might have one in Dungannon, you might have one in Belfast, and you might have one. I'm desperately looking around to see if there's anyone here from Derry, Londonderry. You might have one in Derry. So you'd have. I think the only way you can do it is to have sub-regional centres of excellence that do those type of services. I think we're going to waste loads of time trying to get agreement that it's in one place, because people won't want it in Belfast and people won't want it in other places. So I think that if you have 5 or 6 councils collaborating, or 3 or 4 councils collaborating, that's likely to add benefit. I also think that there's services that people don't see on the ground, backroom services like payroll. People don't see payroll. And a lot of those sort of shared services, I think, if there's a pressure on people, on councils going forward, to set a low rate. Because my final issue is this: you can't have local government reform that brings councils together, that puts the rates up and closes facilities. Because the public are just going to say, well, this has really worked for us, hasn't it? You have to have local government reform which actually shows an improvement. Now, that means that there's going to be a lot of pressure on the 3 councils are coming together. Now, there will be the opportunity to rationalise services, but, in whose district are you going to close the leisure centre? Armagh, Banbridge or Craigavon?
And can I just add that the other key strand of the efficiency was the actual rate base itself. The members set us a target around maximising the collectible rate, which doesn't mean you increase your rates by putting the rates up, but we have taken actions which supports. We have increased the amount of rates that we are collected by Land and Property Services by about £11 million. And that's through a forensic analysis of the actual rate base. So we have been able to compensate for the loss of rates through the recession by doing forensic analysis on inspections of vacant properties, as an example. So we know if a property becomes occupied, we know straight away that that person should be paying rates again. And through that, we have been able to stabilise the rates income. And that's going to continue on to be a key part of our financial strategy for the new council.
Just one very quick observation: sharing of data between statutory agencies and government departments is completely critical. For years, we struggled to get access to the data. When we got access to the data, we took the data provided to us by Land and Property Services, who told us that they couldn't give it to us because of data protection, and we cross-referenced it because you only pay rates if a property is occupied. We cross-referenced their vacant property rates with the premises that we were collecting bins from, There's a good hint that if you're collecting a bin, there might be somebody in it. And we found 13,000 properties, 13,000 properties that people said were vacant, that were occupied. You know, so that, you know, sharing
when they're vacant,
50%.
50% now, but it wasn't when we did it. It wasn't. It came in the last couple. It's 50% now. You're quite right, Madam Chairman. But that sharing of data between agencies for public benefit, I think, is a critical thing, and will also be a critical thing for community planning.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
yeah. And the thing is, I think really your corporate plan, your community plan would be setting the direction for all committees, whether it's executive, streamline or whatever, and plus your code of conduct. Everybody knows their goals and their behaviour that they need to be working, you know, with, and I think that is the main thing. Really.
No, absolutely, Madam Chair.
Lot more up.
Mr McNeely, do you see absenteeism as a driver here?
We have worked very hard on absenteeism in our council. We have reduced our absenteeism from 16.7 days to, and we're very hopeful this year, to get it down to 9.8. Clearly, absenteeism is a critical health indicator of an organisation, because what we have found is that you can get it to come down, but only with absolute dedication to the management of effective absenteeism. We've put additional resources on the management of absenteeism. We've put additional support in to our occupational health, and we have put additional support in to trying to motivate staff. But absenteeism, I think, is a good health indicator of the organisational strength of an organisation, and I do believe that that it is incumbent upon the management of public services organisations to manage it very carefully.
Just to supplement on that, you cited the, which was a very good one, the cross-reference of data in relation to occupied and non-occupied properties. Do you see any potential in doing a similar exercise across this issue? Now, I'm not saying
across absenteeism.
Sorry.
Across absenteeism.
Yes, I mean, local government has a record of a fairly high absenteeism. Not talking about Belfast. I'm talking about local government in general. And do you see any new initiative that could be introduced right across local government to bring this figure down? And you've said, I think you've brought yours down from 16.7, was it, to 9.8, which is quite significant.
Yeah. No, well, it's taken a lot of time and effort. I'm just referring to this report, Achievement and Accountability, Improving Performance in Local Government. One of the core findings of that report is that the sharing of comparative data across authorities is critical to improvement. So there's no question that in terms of setting a proper performance framework for councils, absenteeism should be an indicator of organisational efficiency. And I mean, like, it's a common thing in performance management, you know, that, you know, what gets measured gets done. I mean, if there is, the biggest difference we made to absenteeism is, I have to make this admission, is we made it I made absenteeism a performance target for each of the directors. You know, you either get your absenteeism done or you get a bad performance appraisal. And we also put massive additional resource into managing the policy, the environment, and we have been successful getting it. Now, I think 9.8 is still too much, but we are restrained by the standard terms and conditions across local government, and the standard terms and conditions in the Green Book is that you get 6 months half pay and 6 months full pay when you're sick. You probably wouldn't see that in the private sector. But if you've worked for the council for 30 years and all of a sudden get cancer, maybe it's fair that you have that period of time. But I agree with you, Lord Morrow, that absenteeism would be a good thing to have comparative data on, and to have as performance indicator drive performance across councils.
Thank you. Okay.
The figure usually is affected by long-term sick.
Yes, long-term sick.
People,
that's absolutely
hurt the back or whatever, or stress, then they take 6 months off.
Of course, nobody who works for me would ever be stressed. Not for much longer. My job's in the paper today, so
Is that right?
I'll not have to take it for much longer.
Yeah, and you're not going to steer the sheep to new horizons?
After 13 and a half years, I'm happy to pass the baton on to some other person. It says to be resilient.
Okay. I think you understand me.
Yes, it's not to take a couple of tablets. Headache tablets, I mean. Okay, well, oh, yes, sorry, Ian, you want to come into.
I'm glad when you were referring to which leisure centre to close, you didn't mention Cookstown, Dungannon or Macrofell, because you had a former councillor from each of those areas here, so we all would probably have a conflict of interest. So,
close all. It's a bit of difference to close all three.
So, nonetheless, I'm more interested in, I suppose, in your submission you referred to, this is in respect of whether staff, employees of council should become councillors.
Yes.
And I see your reference was more or less that in England or Wales, officers can be as long as it's in a different authority. My experience, and certainly in speaking to senior officers, have concerns about any aspect of any member of staff of a council working or becoming a councillor, whether it's in their council or any other council. And I suppose if you flip it over to, my experience of the 12 years of council I was in, I can't honestly tell you that I know with 100% how any member of staff of Cookstown District Council voted. It never was discussed, and it's never something that I cared to ask. And I think that's an important part of the role of being a councillor and being a member of staff, that you treat them all the same regardless. The difficulty I have is if you have a member of staff sitting beside someone else who all of a sudden declares their political hand, as it were. In essence, it could, in theory, make sickness absence an issue if people are using that as a means of trying to, get off work for, bullying or any other aspect because of a different political opinion. But I'm interested in your view as a chief officer, how you feel that this issue, would it have an impact on the way you treat a member of staff because they have some political cover? If, for example, they're a member of the party that may be in the majority on the council and they have that cover, they shouldn't, but it's Northern Ireland, and I suppose in a sense, whilst this happens in England and Wales, we're Northern Ireland, and we're different than the rest in that sense because of the political make-up and the way things are in Northern Ireland. So I'm interested in how you see the management of that if it was to happen.
Well, the Staff Code of Conduct requires staff to be politically impartial and objective in terms of how they give their advice. I am completely committed to that. I think it is utterly essential. From a personal point of view, I think it would be an unwise course. We presently have in the Local Government Act that you cannot be a council officer and be a member of a council elsewhere. My understanding is that's been changed because of human rights legislation, but I'm not over the detail of that enough. I think that we would have to manage that very carefully. If the legislation does allow that, and you had a member of staff who was a councillor in another political party, I think we would have to look at, one, whether there were politically sensitive posts, whether there were certain posts in an organisation that were so politically sensitive that you'd have to declare a conflict of interest if you were a councillor in another party. And I think we would also have to make sure that there was a special arrangement that if you became a councillor elsewhere, that you would have to sign up to some sort of memorandum of impartiality which set out the requirements that within the context of how you performed your duties in that particular council, you were not allowed to take cognizance of other things. And at least that puts a management framework around it. Whether it would work, I think it would be very difficult. I think you're quite right. Northern Ireland is a different place, and it would be extremely difficult. And what would happen is that elected members from certain political parties, I think, would be cautious in terms of accepting the advice or sometimes accepting the impartiality of somebody who might be a member of a political party elsewhere. So I think it is something to be cautious about, and if it does happen, that would need careful management.
Thank you.
I think that's correct, and I think what you'll find, Madam Chair, is that the English model is actually the bare minimum that's regarded as being necessary in terms of being compliant in terms of human rights, and the position as adopted in the bill is something that was cognizant of the position in relation to human rights, and that's why it's in there.
We're going to clarify maybe what the officials after you. Certainly, research is saying that in 1998 the case was thrown out of court, and then there's 2000 more recent ones. I don't know what was the outcome of it.
I think the English model, where where the councillor can be a councillor but not an employing authority, is regarded generally as being the minimum that's required for compliance with the Human Rights Act.
Okay, we'll sort that out.
Yeah, suppose the other key issue in that is
yeah.
there's a reasonable argument on that basis on it. If that has been the case for quite a long period in England, if it's not been provoked as a result of a recent legal challenge, then I suppose the other issue a little bit is, why was a particular position then simply allowed to happen for many, many years, and consequently why is the imperative now? But that's obviously something we'll probe with some of the
I think the Chief Executive's right, though. You probably do need additional provisions or protections in there in those situations where they are.
But I have every confidence in Linda McHugh clarifying the situation.
Okay, well, Linda, no pressure now. Well, thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, and happy retirement. Are you retiring or moving on?
No, too young to retire, Madam
You're
Chairman.
too young, yeah.
I'll go and dabble in other things. But can I say what a great pleasure it was to appear before the Environment Committee, and can I wish you sincerely well in your deliberations, and I do think that this will be a really notable piece of work, and will stand local government in good stead for the next 30 years. So thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Okay. So, members, we certainly have quite a lot of queries still, I think, to ask the departmental officials. So the next item, members, will be briefing from the officials on the bill. Also, there are a large number of tabled paper, 8 papers from the officials. So I'm sure, member, you probably don't have time this morning to read through it. You're all very welcome again, Linda, Julie, and Mylene here too, is that right? And John. You're very welcome. I'm sure you all have been working overtime on this. It is a large piece of legislation, and there's so many different now comments and issues coming at it, and and trying to take on board of all those issues. Yes, scratching your head out. Okay, Linda, we know you've given us 8 papers. I have to say it's a bit disappointing. We're waiting until yesterday. Still didn't get it until what, late yesterday?
No, about 5.
5 o'clock. I know. I kept my email on to try to see if I could get the table paper. So we really don't have time. I tried to read some of it this morning, but we really, all of us, don't have time to read through it. So appreciate if you can go through it thoroughly with us. What, an hour for you? Yeah.
Thanks for the opportunity for doing this. I know these are areas that there has been quite a number of comments from other people, and that you have a need for further clarification on. And we did try to get you the papers as soon as possible, but we were told on Friday afternoon these were needed, so we did work quite hard to try and get them to you, at least in advance of the meeting. But we appreciate, and in fact we didn't expect, that the committee would have had time to read through them in advance of us coming here today. So we are going to go through these these individually in some detail, and I'm joined by members of my legislation team, and Julie and John are going to take you through the first 6 papers, and then I'll talk to the 7th. But at various points, all of us may come in if there's additional questions being asked. If we can then just move on to the first paper, and I'll ask Julie to take that. And I think that's on removing the blanket prohibition on council officers being councillors.
Okay, yes, I think some clarification was needed about the various pieces of legal advice and legal cases on this issue. Section 41A of the 1972 Local Government Act specifies that a person is disqualified from being a councillor if he holds any paid office or other place of profit in the gift or disposal of that or any other council. We first became aware that there was a human rights issue in this in 2005, when the Department received correspondence from a solicitor acting on behalf of a council employee, which alleged that this provision violated Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which provides the right of freedom of expression. We sought legal advice on the matter, which indicated that there was a strong argument that Section 41A is disproportionate to the legitimate aim pursued, and the advice went on to indicate that it could convincingly be argued that the provision poses a general, automatic and indiscriminate restriction on a vitally important convention right. The advice pointed to the possibility of a successful legal challenge to the provision on the grounds that it would violate Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And in the legal advice that we got, the case law quoted in support of this advice was a 2005 case, Hurst versus the United Kingdom, number 2, 2005. And this was in relation to the Representation of the People Act 1983, which barred Mr Hurst and others from voting in Parliament and local elections, and it was held to be incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. Yes, it's a relevant judgment in that it's about blanket restrictions in relation to elections and voting. And that particular case was about voting in Parliament and local elections, whereas the Section 4 case is about placing a blanket restriction on someone being a councillor. So the intention had been to bring the necessary amendment forward to Section 4 as part of the legislation associated with the Local Government Reform Programme. And the position on this was confirmed in 2009 by the then Minister of the Environment, that we would be taking forward an amendment to Section 4. If we look at the position in other jurisdictions, then in England, Scotland and Wales, we carried out some research on what happened to see how the issue of employees as councillors was dealt with elsewhere, and to assist us in identifying how we could best remove the blanket prohibition. And in England and Wales, prior to 1989, an employee of a local authority was disqualified from being a member of that authority by virtue of Section 80 of the Local Government Act 1972. The equivalent provision in Scotland, Section 31 of the Local Government Scotland Act 1972, and these provisions allowed a local authority employee to become a member of another local authority. And this was an issue, a thing known as twin tracking, where you could be a councillor on another authority, but you weren't allowed to be a councillor on the authority that you were employed by. In response to adverse publicity about this twin tracking issue, the UK Government in 1985 established a committee of inquiry into the conduct of local authority business. And this committee considered the issue of local authority employees also being members of a local authority. 3 arguments about twin tracking were considered: that 1, there could be a conflict of interest; 2, in relation to excessive paid leave; and 3, in relation to political impartiality. And the committee rejected the first argument, concluded that the second argument could be dealt with separately in relation to rules for remuneration and time off, But the third argument, the one about political impartiality, led to the recommendation that senior officers of a council should not be politically active and, as a consequence, should not be councillors. The UK Government accepted this recommendation and in 1989 made provision on the disqualification and political restriction of certain officers and staff. And the Local Government and Housing Act 1989 subsequently provided that a person shall be disqualified from becoming, whether by election or otherwise, or remaining a member of a local authority if he holds a politically restricted post under that local authority or any other local authority in Great Britain. Section 2 of the 1989 Act sets out the persons that are to be regarded as holding politically restricted posts for the purposes of Section 1. Subsequently, a number of senior local authority employees, in the case of Ahmed et al. Versus the UK Government, took a case to the European Court of Human Rights on the basis that regulations made under Section 1 of the 1989 Act interfered with their rights under Article 10 of the Charter. And in its judgment, the Court found that the restrictions were not open to challenge on the grounds that regulations only applied to carefully defined categories of senior officers who perform duties in respect of which political impartiality vis-à-vis council members and public is paramount. So this wasn't that there was a blanket ban. The judgment was that actually, as long as there wasn't a blanket ban or an indiscriminate ban, that was, it's perfectly okay for those people who held politically restricted posts shouldn't be allowed to be councillors. In the Republic of Ireland, the Local Government Act 2001 provides that persons employed by a local authority are not eligible to be elected members unless they belong to a class, description or grade that may be specified in subordinate legislation. And this is really linked to the maximum level of remuneration that someone will be paid. So really it's anyone above the grade of a clerical officer would be restricted. The Department's position on this is, we've provided provision in the Local Government Bill to remove the blanket prohibition on council employees, because that was the 2005 advice that we got, was that that would be could be challenged under Article 10. The enabling power provides us in Schedule 1 to the Bill to specify in regulations those offices and employments to which individuals are appointed by a council that will disqualify that individual from being a councillor. And the Department recognises the concerns expressed in relation to permitting a council employee to be a councillor on his or her employing council. And so we are seeking advice from Departmental Solicitor's Office on whether the provision as introduced would allow the Department to specify in the regulations that we can make under Schedule 1 that employment on the council to which election is sought would be included as a disqualifying employment. And the intention, we're looking and we're working with the local the legislation working group on what should be in those regulations, and we'll then be putting recommendations to the Minister on that.
So you pick what's deemed sensitive, politically sensitive posts. It looks like the Republic of Ireland makes it easiest above certain grade.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think in England and Wales, they've said it as, they've disqualified the head of parent service, which would be the equivalent, perhaps, of our chief executive or clerk, and statutory officers. So, for example, the chief finance officer, are officers who, on a regular basis, provide advice to the council or one of its committees. So, those who are actually involved in that, you could argue, in the decision-making process of the council. So you said it, but you would then that sort of staff who are working to the chief executive, but not perhaps sort of the administrative staff. So you try and define, very clear at that high level. But as Julia said, Madam Chair, we're working with local government senior officers, to refine this list for advice to the Minister. And then, of course, we would be going, subject to his views, out to consultation.
And there needs to be consistency as well. between councils, yeah. And what about for people then, for employees of one council standing for office in another council?
Yes, we're getting legal advice on that issue about whether the enabling power that we have would be sufficient to allow us to specify that if the minister wants to, do that the enabling power is enough, so that we can do that in the regulations rather than needing to make an amendment to the bill. And as soon as we get that legal advice, we will, of course, bring the outcome of that to the committee.
And would that be a restriction on the politically sensitive staff as well, whether they're allowed to stand for other councils?
That would be, in many ways, there's two elements here. One is whether someone who is a councillor should be allowed to be, someone who's an employee should be allowed to be a councillor on their own council. And the advice we're getting is whether, because of the comments that we've received about that, that really actually causes so many difficulties and so many conflicts, that actually it would be advisable if that was not the case. So that's one element. The other element is this issue of what are politically sensitive posts and what posts in a council should prevent you from being a councillor in any council, not just the one that you're employed by.
And I think, Madam Chair, that's where the ACMA judgment, provides us that sort of the case law that you can have that level of restriction.
You can have the blanket ban, as you say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Any questions on this paper? Lord Morrow? Yeah.
Julie, it's in around paragraph 8 of your paper. You speak here of the three arguments against twin tracking, and you talk then about conflict of loyalty.
Yes.
Is loyalty and interest here the same word?
You have looked at that particular.
Yes. No, I think that is where your loyalty lies. Whether as a councillor, does your loyalty lie to your party and its views rather than the council that you're there as an officer to serve?
Yeah. Well, I do have a problem with it in this respect, that I would find it would be difficult for any employee of a council sitting on that council and wearing two hats. I mean, surely there would be, on umpteen occasions, they would have to be opting out of discussion and debate, maybe leaving the room, and they would become, it could well be that their whole career as a councillor will become dysfunctional, and indeed, I suspect it would also become dysfunctional in relation to their employment also, because they would be finding themselves having to declare a declaration of interest not only at their place of employment, but at council meetings. Would that not be right?
And is it that if they were an employee of the council that they would be a councillor of? Is that your main concern?
More so in that instance, but I believe it would
equally?
also be prevalent,
Right.
even they weren't, if it was another council.
Yes.
I'm taking it, for instance, around staffing issues, and appointment of staffing.
Yes.
And these are emotive issues, so they are. And it's got to the stage, perhaps long past it, where councillors do not participate in the appointment of staff. How would it then be that if, well, let's take for instance the appointment of a chief executive, where indeed councillors do have, up to a certain level, some input into that appointment. Where would that person find themselves on that, if they had two roles here, a dual role?
And that's actually why we're looking, I've been researching this issue, because we've received comments. I mean, the committee have raised issues about it, trade union side have raised issues, councils have raised issues about this, in particular people being allowed to be councillors on the council that employ them, that there seems to be so many practical issues involved with that. That's why we're carrying out research on that, to put advice to the Minister. The legal cases seem to point to the fact that the challenge could be had on the grounds if it's an indiscriminate ban. Therefore, we have to look at the level that would be acceptable, and as some of the people from Belfast were saying earlier, there seems to be in England and Wales a minimum level where you have these, people who are in politically restricted posts can't be councillors, but equally you cannot be a councillor if you're an employee of a particular council, of that council. So that's why we've been looking at that again, because we recognise the issues that have been raised.
Can I further ask, Chair, in relation to the department, are you in the position where you were saying, look, the department would much prefer that this was not? However, I recognise that there are, but the case that has been highlighted and all that, and I understand that, and so therefore you must try to address that and deal with it. But would it be true to say that your starting point is, look, we would prefer the status quo in that this is not the position because?
Well, I think it's an issue that it's something that we need to put to the Minister and get the Minister's view on.
Yeah, well, in fairness, I suppose, to the Minister on this one, I mean, whatever his own personal view is or is not, and I don't know what it is, and it's a good job we don't know at this stage, he may just take, I mean, if I was the Minister, I think my view would be, no, it shouldn't happen. But I recognise that that wouldn't be a good enough answer, because, I mean, there are things that you folk have cited here, and not least in your paper also. But, I mean, is it not reasonable that the department should say, no, we feel the status quo is the best and safest and most transparent way forward here?
I think that needs to be taken into context in terms of the legal position. And if the legal position has been clearly defined and the current status quo is deemed to be unlawful or illegal, I think there is unchallengeable. I mean, I think there is a role for the department to play in making sure that the framework that we put to councils is workable and will not lead to undue challenge. Therefore, whether it's practically acceptable or feasible in the context of Northern Ireland, that the Minister would have to weigh that against, the option and potential for legal challenge. And this is something that we will have to put to the Minister, and we're doing a lot of work to develop the briefing for him as well, on the basis of all of this.
Chair, I fully understand and accept what's been said here, that because of I think you have a dilemma, and because of the legal position, and it's good. We can talk about these things now because it doesn't exist at the moment. So therefore, we're all free to talk about them in that they were not. There's not a case that we have in the back of our minds, right? We know that that's not the case, so therefore we're talking here from a clean sheet of paper, as the saying is. But I do honestly think that if, bear in mind the legal position, the challengeable position, but I do think if down that road, and it may well be that we will have to, then it will present enormous problems somewhere down the road. Thank you, Chair.
The department's hands are tied. You have to do something, but you have to just find the best way to safeguard the proper working of the councils.
Address the legal advice that we've received.
We've never been challenged, but then the law is going to be here for another 50, 60 years, and you never know. Yeah, Tom?
Chair, thanks.
Again,
clarification, folks, thanks for that. But let's be absolutely clear, there is no test case so far, either locally in UK or in Europe, that says that what we have at the moment is wrong.
There's no, well, because the situation, the cases in England, because the situation is different in England.
Yeah, but that's what I'm
legal
saying.
advice, yes.
There is no test case either locally in England or in Europe to say that our position currently is wrong.
There are other cases which were being, which we've been pointed to, that it is wrong to have an indiscriminate.
Yeah. But I'm assuming that's the way the judgment was made in Europe over the English case.
Yes.
It might be useful actually to give us the exact form of words that was said at that at some stage.
We can send that to you.
Yeah, and the second advice is in relation to that 2005 case over the prisoner voting rights. But that's only advice. There's been no test of that.
That was a case.
No, well,
Yes, it was a case on the prisoner's voting rights, but it wasn't a case on the law in relation to stopping council employees being
That's right.
councillors.
That's right.
Okay. So we don't have any case law that currently stipulates our particular case, Chair. That's the key point here. But there is advice, obviously, but no case law.
Yeah, yeah.
No, so, and I do appreciate the difficulties of trying to strike the balance as well. I totally accept that. It is a difficult one. And obviously, we don't want to get on the wrong side of the law, but as others have pointed out, I think it would be impractical, to allow some people who are senior council employees or politically sensitive, whatever way it's called, to become councillors. Accept that. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. But probably in reality, council employees would not touch it with a barge pole. It would be to their detriment to be caught in the middle between your work and your party policies. And
You need to square that word, to their detriment. That's, I thought, was to be. It was not to be to their detriment.
no, if they're caught between their work, they're carrying out their duties impartially and being a member of a political party that may have issues with whatever policies or decisions made by committees or council as a whole, then they're caught in the middle.
Chair, yes, but if the protection's there to allow them to do it,
Yes.
they're protected.
Yes.
Even no matter what detriment there is an element of protection for them because they have that political protection almost immediately.
Yeah.
But
Well, yes, I mean,
with Lord Moore, I have major concerns about it, but I understand the legality aspect of it. But I think
It's a practicality.
any right-thinking party or would think twice about allowing it to happen. You can't account for independence, of course, but I think hopefully that's a thing of the past. But nonetheless, it's.
Sure. Pam, would you like to come
Thank
in?
you, Chair. Yes, I have to say I agree wholeheartedly with most of my colleagues' comments on this particular issue. I mean, it doesn't seem, certainly in my eyes, it doesn't seem even workable. It would be a real dilemma to have someone in this position. What is the major risk, saying that your legal advice comes back allowing you to, say, retain a blanket ban? What is the big risk? Is the big risk that somebody does take the case to court? Is that the biggest risk involved?
Yes, and in 2005, that's why we became aware of this, because a solicitor from an employee had written to us to say that they were thinking of taking a case because of the blanket ban, and that's when we got the legal advice.
But in practice, in other parts of the UK, they are doing that now. They have, restriction on employees. So, I mean, it is working in the rest of the UK. So, I mean, how many employees do we know? What percentage of employees in other jurisdictions have this dual role? I don't know.
Although, Chair, you might have to speak to those employees to see if it does actually work. Obviously, the positions are there in place, but how effective they are as employees, I don't know. Maybe that question would be asked.
Yeah. I mean, I would say it's not only difficult for the employers and the councillors, it's difficult also for the employees themselves. If kind of people don't feel they have confidence in you, in your judgment, in your advice, and why bother to work? Yeah. Ian, you want to come in?
No, my point was just Tom covered it there. I thought there'd been examples, throughout Europe or the greater world, of a system like this that has actually been in place for a while, and maybe they discovered after a period of time that they had to, to rejig it or whatever, because of whatever it threw up, with the employees, So I take it there has been research done, throughout, in other systems and that there in Europe and that.
We looked at systems in other jurisdictions, in England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. We didn't look at other European, but we can have a look to see whether there is anything there.
Well, all I'm saying is there, if there was, then, it may be there for maybe 10 years or more, maybe, or whatever, and they've tested the system to see how it has worked out, and maybe we could learn something from that. That's my thinking.
Sorry?
Does it happen in the Irish Republic?
They work above.
There's certain, yes, there's certain. It really would appear to be that people who are paid a certain level are allowed to be. There's a maximum level of remuneration above which you cannot be a councillor, and in effect, that's really.
Is that challengeable up to a certain level?
No, because then that's not a blanket prohibition.
Oh. Right, so you can go so far and council but no further.
Yes. And that's why it's a balance between what would mean that we weren't falling foul of the European human rights legislation and what is practicable and workable.
Unless it's allowed, does it happen? Sorry. Are you aware of it actually happening? It may be allowed to that level, but is there any...
It'd be difficult to sort of do the actual research because
individual councils.
You're talking about while you could identify the individual councillors, you couldn't necessarily find out whether they were actually employees of a council, unless you actually went to the all the councils and asked for a list of their employees.
We spent a day on the phone for the
Come back in. Yeah.
Down south there, are you talking? When was that introduced? Let's see.
It was 2001, I think it was.
So, maybe the question should be asked there: how is it working there? What difficulties are they finding? This is the only way I think that you can find out these things.
We could certainly consult with our counterparts
Yeah.
and see if they're aware that this has caused a major issue or not.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we can do that.
Thank you,
for
Chair.
all.
And at what grade are we really talking only of kind of administrative, clerical staff allowed? And, only clerical staff.
Clerical officer and below can be a councillor, but anyone above that can't.
Yeah.
But once again, that's not a blanket prohibition, and that's.
Are there different grades in clerical officers?
Well, that is a complication, I think, in local government in Northern Ireland, where there is at times a lack of consistency in terms of who does what job at what grade from council to council. Now, I know this is something that councils are working at, but it's still not there. And I think I don't know exactly, but I mean that's possibly why a level of pay has been set as opposed to a grade, because that was maybe seen as the best proxy for positions of responsibility.
Yeah.
We can certainly contact our counterparts and see if it is an issue that's been raised with them.
Okay. I don't want to dwell on this too much with so many papers to go through. Next one, Julie again. Yeah. Yes.
Madam Chair, I'll take it.
Yeah.
And if I can sort of do a very brief introduction to cover both the next three papers, because they all are based on sort of proposals that came from one of the policy development panels. And I just quickly remind members that sort of following Arlene Foster's statement on the Executive's decisions on the future shape of local government in 2008, the Department established the Strategic Leadership Board, chaired by the Environment Minister, with representatives from the five main political parties, to develop policy and implementation proposals for the reform programme. And that board in turn established three policy development panels, again with elected representatives from the 5 main political parties, all of whom were actually serving councillors. And one of those panels was responsible for looking at governance and relationships. And it's just sort of, to put into context then that, this is where the policies that are sort of reflected in the bill are drawn largely from the work of that panel. In terms of the positions of responsibility, the executive was and remains committed to governance arrangements in the new councils that provide for the sharing of positions of responsibility across the political parties and independents represented on a council. In considering this issue, the Policy Development Panel considered a research paper that was prepared by the Joint Secretariat, comprising officials from the Department and officers from NILGA, which sort of identified the various sort of processes that you could use to achieve that proportionality. There were the divisor methods of D'Hunt, which everyone knows through the operation in the Assembly, and St Lag, which is a similar process, except that the divisor is slightly different to allow for a greater sharing. And then there were also then the 2 quota methods of droop quota and quota greatest remainder, where you would then, if you used those, you would determine, right, a particular party was entitled to a certain number of seats or positions, and it would be for them to select. At that time as well, though, the Alliance Party put onto the table a paper on recommending and sort of advocating the use of the single transferable vote, which would allow then members of the council to vote for those people that they felt best fitted that a particular position, and would allow parties to maybe come together in terms of that election of that individual. The panel in its deliberation felt that to provide flexibility for councils, in the new arrangements, that they would actually they should have a list available that they could use either D'Hunt, St Lag, or the single transferable vote. But what was very clear within the discussions in the Policy Development Panel was that although you would provide that flexibility at the local level, that those councillors who would choose to, say, use D'Hunt, that we would specify how that should operate, and the same with St Lag and with STB, so that you have that consistency of approach across all the councils. We've used the term prescribed flexibility. So as I say, the council could choose from, the D'Hunt, St Lag or STB, but then the actual approach to using that method is prescribed. What the panel also agreed was that that should be a decision that would be taken by qualified majority voting, so that you have a degree of protection in there for the interests of the smaller parties and the minority communities. So that was where I was coming through. So as I say, there is that.
Method needs majority voting, weighted majority voting. Okay.
Yes, and if you don't achieve that, then the default position would be D'Hunt, and that was an agreement across the political parties on the Policy Development Panel. So there is that flexibility built in by having that choice.
The default position is still D'Hunt if there is no local agreement.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I believe the paper I just heard yesterday, is that right? We had a piece of research paper on STV that has been withdrawn.
It was a few words.
There's some mistakes in it. So a new paper will be issued.
That's right.
On the STV. We asked the research staff to produce this paper just to explain what's the STV. Yeah.
For some stuff John said, I suppose the other bit when we're looking at why there's a prescribed, what they call prescribed flexibility, or what was they prescribed? is that there has been, particularly saying to hunt, or it applies to almost any of the bits on it, that it has been something that has been used by a lot of councils, particularly as regards positions of responsibility. The problem on it is either sometimes simply because they've seen it, they've just wanted to use it a different way, sometimes through ignorance or whatever. The actual formula has been applied differently, and I suppose the concern particularly is that on occasions and in different bits it has maybe been applied simply on a one-year basis. And what, of course, if you're looking, I suppose part of the bit is if you're looking to have a broad proportionality and actually have arguably the fairest from that point of view side of it, if you simply use it 1 year, what you actually do is you perpetuate sometimes a particular inequality just keeps on coming up year after year, whereas actually a lot of that irons out mathematically if you do it on a 4-year basis. And sometimes for various reasons, particular parties that have been, a bigger party has quite often been keen to use it on a 1-year basis, on the basis that they get, 2/3 of the places on something and perpetually get that disproportionately. So I think that's why, if the hunt or indeed any of the formulas were to be used, it's got to be used in exactly the same way across every council to stop either inadvertently or advertently sort of a degree of abusive position in that regard.
Is STV a better solution for councils with kind of not one particular dominance over the other? Would that be a fairer system?
I would say that's a matter for the
discussion, and I suppose STV, whenever it was debated in Policy Development Panel A, one of the reasons STV was specifically mentioned, obviously, was to provide people with as many options. The problem with STV is STV will work quite well if you have, again, it's a wee bit mathematical in relation to that, if you have a very small number of positions over and a larger sort of electorate, in the same way as you, I suppose, electing this, you're electing 6. If you, for instance, have which will be the case in most councils, 40 councillors, and for the sake of argument, the only positions that were being appointed was here's a ring-fenced group of 6, STV can work fairly well. And then, from a practical point of view, once you have the pool of positions at a very large number of positions, STV becomes fairly meaningless, because if you take, for example, say you are filling, particularly if you'd apply this across the board in terms of things of external positions, external appointments, council may well have, in terms of the main chairmanships and external positions, might have, say, 40 happening in any one particular year, or 50 happening in a particular year, or 60, whatever it happens to be, and you apply that across the 4 years, so you're electing, if you like, or you're selecting via a system 200 positions, and you have an electorate of 40. Well, the quota then, everybody's casting 1 vote, for instance, and the quota for that would be about 0.2 of 1 vote. So what I'm saying is the point is, in certain regards, is the higher the number of the positions to ensure quality on that, the less suitable STV comes to a particular position in that. That's where the complication on the thing lies. So the only way you could do that would be to keep on breaking it down into individual bits, and that actually then also is a degree of problem, because if you have something workable that says, well, actually it works reasonably well in a group of 40 if you have, say, 6 positions. The problem with that is, and you keep on then breaking it down to 10 groups of 6 and keep on repeating the exercise, you could get a situation where, say, for the sake of argument, a party maybe has 3 positions, has 3 councillors. Because maybe nobody else then votes for them or transfers to them, they can constantly be basically kept out of the 6 positions no matter what, if you break it down to things. So I think the problem on it is that if you had something that was a one-off, very small group, it works quite well. Once you move outside of that, mathematically, it can run into much greater difficulties.
Okay.
I'll be sending a joint consultancy fee and Peter McNally later on.
You rest your case.
John, I've never been in council, so I know the practicality of it is sometimes difficult to grasp. But anyway, I'd have to declare my hand. I think the Alliance Party would be quite keen to put in an amendment to make STV the default position rather than the hunt. Just to alert members. Yep. Okay. No questions? Anybody any questions on the position of responsibility? How to share it out? No? Okay, we're moved on to the next paper, John.
The next paper, Madam Chair, sort of addresses the issue of sort of like political governance arrangements. In other words, the sort of the decision-making structures that the new councils will be able to sort of operate. The bill really provides for two basic forms, and these were debated through, again, in the Policy Development Panel. There were executive arrangements. The panel looked at sort of research paper on sort of what was happening in England, Scotland and Wales in particular, because in 2000 the Local Government Act required council or local authorities in England to adopt executive arrangements. And that took three forms. You would have an elected mayor and cabinet, an appointed mayor and cabinet, or a leader and cabinet appointed by the council. In the smaller local authorities, they could operate sort of alternative arrangements, basically streamlined committee, but it was still an executive form. So that was prescribed specified in the legislation in the 2000 Act. In Scotland, they had also moved along the road of developing executive arrangements to sort of improve and speed up the decision-making process. Some local authorities in Scotland had adopted executive, the strict cabinet-style executive. Others had adopted a streamlined committee, while some at that stage remained with the normal committee system. They were doing it on a voluntary basis within the provisions of the Local Government Act, Local Government Scotland Act 1973. When the panel were looking at it, they felt that while executive arrangements in either the sort of the full cabinet or the streamlined committee would provide for improved decision making in the new councils, where you have a greater number of functions and a larger area, there was, I suppose, a degree of sort of, not reluctance, but a recognition that the committee system had worked well in Northern Ireland for all those years, and that should be included in the options that would be available. It is interesting to note that in 2011, the Localism Act restored the ability of local authorities in England to use the committee system, so they had recognised that in some cases there were difficulties. I think there is maybe some degree, sometimes there's sort of confusion over sort of, particularly the streamlined committee system, because of the fact that it mentioned
committees, really.
It mentions streamline, it mentions committee, but it is a form of executive. So and therefore, if you go the streamlined committee, where you're actually, those committees would be taking decisions. Rather, in the cabinet style, all the power or decision making would be vested in that one group of maximum of 10 councillors. Whereas the streamlined executive allows you to then sort of split those same responsibilities across a number of committees. So it begins to sort of allocate the responsibility across other members. But I think the key aspect is that both of them have within them, the overview and scrutiny, so that you have that level of protection in terms of the decision making, so that you have an overview and scrutiny committee arrangement to work with that. The thing is, in both of these executive arrangements, you still have the ability of a council to arrange for the discharge of its functions by a normal committee that would either be making decisions itself or referring the matters, making recommendations to the full council. Because if we look at the sort of the situation particularly in England and Wales, where planning and other regulatory and quasi-judicial functions are not devolved in executive arrangements, they remain the responsibility of the full council for it to determine how it wishes that to be discharged. And the council can then decide whether, as I say, it wants to have a committee that sort of will look at that issue and refer it back to the council for full decision, or whether the council in itself says, right, we will allow that committee to make the decisions, because within that sort of function and that decision-making process, there are rights of appeal outside of the sort of the overview and scrutiny arrangements.
The like of licensing or planning committees, for example, would, in England would fall into that.
Like PAC outside of the council?
Yes.
Okay. So the executive.
Okay, members, any question on the governance structures? Okay. I think I recall there are people querying about the mayor and mayor not being allowed to be in the executive.
I think that comes down to a view of the fact that the sort of the mayor and deputy mayor, or the chair and vice chair of the council, are
They're the same thing, aren't they? Chair and vice chair is the same
as the mayor and deputy.
Mayor
Yes,
and deputy mayor.
because the mayor and deputy mayor would be in a borough council or a city council. But the view is that they are there as the sort of the civic representative. They're representing the whole council, whereas the decision making, but and in some respects, should be separate and seen as separate from that decision making. Although that within the sort of the normal council structure, yes, they are sort of the chair of the meeting and they would have a casting vote, but it is that that wouldn't operate within the sort of the executive.
Could I make a suggestion in relation to this, which I don't think look at? I appreciate the point in relation that you're trying to separate out almost the two functions in relation to that. I'm not sure that just quite as neat as that, because with the greatest respect, the mayor or council chairman will be seen as the sort of the representative of the council, and for them to be completely detached from the executive side of things. On the other hand, I can see that could potentially, if you're on an executive situation, and I suspect, to be honest, we'll probably have executive situations. Surely one way around that is, the important thing actually is, in certain regards, that the mayor or council chairman is fully aware of what is happening, that they perhaps even are able to express a view in relation to that. Surely one way is, if you're, and I don't know whether this is part of the legislation or whether it's part of the recommendations in relation to that, surely the thing is actually to provide for the mayor or council chairman, deputy mayor, whatever, to be an ex officio member of the executive committee, but on the basis of it being a non-voting member, so that they have access, if you like, to the meetings. They're able to hear what's going on. They can see what's going on, but they, from that point of view, don't affect the mathematics of whatever's on the thing. They don't have a particular portfolio under those circumstances. Now, as I said, I think a lot of this may be slightly moot in the short term, because I can't see any of the councils going immediately for an executive type position. But that's possibly a way to square the circle. A lot of councils, for instance, will have a situation, and whether it's voting or not, where, for instance, the mayor and deputy mayor will be ex officio member of every committee. And I suspect it may vary from place to place as to whether or not that person has a vote or not. But from a practical point of view, they effectively then would have a right to be in any meetings type of thing. And that's maybe the way to square the circle in some of the concerns, to be honest.
I find it very odd when you say you're the head of the council and yet you're not in the executive. Boris Johnson probably would never agree to something like that. Yeah.
But I think that Madam Chair, I think in terms of attendance at meetings, the sort of the other provisions within the bill in terms of access to meetings and documents, would sort of certainly provide for other members of the council, just individual members, to be at an executive meeting, but certainly
we can look at that and bring it back to the minister.
Yeah. Okay. No questions on this one. We'll move on to the next. And John, you again? Yes.
The final paper in this group looks at the issue of sort of call-in and qualified majority voting, and I know that there has been quite a bit of interest in this. If I can sort of, again, this was sort of one that sort of was the subject quite intense and interesting debate within the sort of the policy development panel in terms of looking at how protections for the interests of minorities in the decision-making process could be developed. Initially, the panel started looking at those in the context of executive arrangements where decisions were being taken outside of the full council sort of framework. But it was then expanded where the elected representatives felt that it should also apply in the traditional. If a council goes for the traditional committee system, it should also apply there. As I say, it's there as a means of protecting the interests. And it was, when the panel looked at sort of two methods, because, as I say, initially we were looking at the operation in the context of an executive, and we looked at the panel looked at the sort of situation in England and Wales, where it was largely around procedural matters, where an executive had made a decision, the decision was published, and then members of the authority could then decide, well, they haven't taken certain factors into account, or they've taken into account factors that they shouldn't have taken into account. The Wednesbury rule. But we were looking at that. But as I say, there was the view that yes, that's fine in terms of basic procedures, but there was that view that we also then needed to build in a system for a call-in on where a decision or a recommendation that was coming forward from a committee for ratification by the council could have an adverse impact on a particular section of the community. And that's where we're going. At the minute, we're currently working with senior officers from local government through the legislation working group to try and sort of refine and work through the criteria for both of the call-in processes, and also to work through the process that would apply. And as the Minister stated in a answer to an AQ, those will be covered and included in standing orders as a mandatory element, so that there is consistency in the operation of that process across all of the new councils. On the other side of that, and then again as a protection, the panel looked at what other protections you could put in, and it came to the view that qualified majority voting was one way that you could do that. There was, as I say, the discussion around the level at which that should be set, and both for the QMV and the trigger for call-in. There was a recognition that you would perhaps if you looked at each of the potential at each of the individual councils, they would need different levels because of the potential makeup. But the panel took you couldn't get into that and you can never predict what an election result might do in terms of the makeup. So they agreed that it had to be standard across all councils, and they felt that 15% as the trigger for call-in represented a suitable balance between providing that protection, but trying to ensure that you weren't allowing one or two people to start blocking the decision making, because in a number of councils in England, although they don't have the call-in for adverse impact, you have a situation where maybe 3 members in maybe a 50-member local authority can call in a decision for scrutiny by the Overbearing Scrutiny Committee. So as I say, there was that. The panel were looking at how do we strike that balance. And it was the same then with the threshold for qualified majority voting, because if you put it too high, you'll never get all business will come to a standstill. But equally, if you put it too low, then there could be circumstances where an individual party or a number of parties could put things through. So there was that balance had to be struck. There was then some discussion within the council, within the panel, around the list of the issues that would be subject to qualified majority voting, and certainly at that stage there was the issue around, the method to be used for ensuring proportionality was one of the ones that was clearly there, the governance arrangements. But what was very clear was that some of the other sort of statutory functions of a council, the likes of the setting the rate and some of those other aspects, would be outside the scope of both call-in and QMV, because the council has to strike a rate, by and particularly by a certain date. So you moved with them. But again, we're working currently with senior officers from a number of councils to try and refine the list, because we understand that there are difficulties, and it's trying to get the right balance, that you are providing those protections, but that you're not blocking every single aspect of the work of a council.
Yeah. And as I said earlier, a list can never be the catch-all list, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's your difficulty. Like Peter was saying earlier, you could have parks, you could have different things, leisure centres, mentioned by Peter. So, setting that criteria is going to be quite difficult. You're going to try to cover everything.
Yeah. I think it's a case of trying to, particularly trying to establish a list that covers those issues that could have the impact and requires the support of the majority of the council, and of course in response to a valid call-in on the grounds of adverse impact, that then needs to be sort of in there. But as I say, we're working to try and refine that.
A number of councils have spoken about, their worry that, council decisions could grind to a halt. Will be delay for decisions if there's such a low call-in percentage and yet such a high QMT.
Yes.
And that's the reason, sorry.
No, Chair, just in relation on the percentage, there was a couple of separate issues. On the percentage issues, both of the 15 to 20, that was something that was agreed by all 5 major parties at that, and those were set. Those were agreed collectively and unanimously by all the parties. The issue, and I suppose maybe a bit of concern on things, is I think there's clearly an issue about definitional bit of what qualifies as a call-in, a bit of further work done that. I would be extremely wary and worried if beyond what was there for the call-in, I appreciate there will be certain issues such as the issues around positions responsibility will clearly require, and have been flagged up for quite a long period of time, would clearly require a QMV and need to be put in that. If beyond that there is a list of which outside of a call-in requires a QMV, I think there is a very major minefield there, that you are going to get into a situation that almost anything could be arguable to be in that, and the whole thing could grind to a halt. And I think the principal protection on QMV should be the call-in, and I think outside of maybe 1 or 2 examples on it, that should be where the trigger point is for QMV, other than simply a long or whatever list of potential circumstances. I think the point was made by the Chief Executive of Belfast City Council that I doubt you may not be considering this, but for instance, one issue was raised, well, if it's something impacts in on a range of DEAs of strategic nature, and the Chief Executive of Belfast City Council, and I suspect this will be the case increasingly for a lot of the rest of the vast bulk of their decisions are actually things which impact it, so that would actually mean potentially almost anything could be QMV'd, and that would create, I think, a major problem. I think you do have quite good protections with call-in to lead to QMV, and I think beyond that, the case for going much beyond that, outside of the likes of the positions responsibility stuff, which is something which is clearly going to be part of the legislation, etc. I would be very wary about going beyond that.
Others have mentioned about a time scale. Would you include a time scale for, call-in and then decision making kind of over time?
Yes, Madam Chair. Certainly, the work that we're doing with the senior officers, as I say, is looking at the whole, the process for the call-in. So we're ensuring that sort of that the time, we're looking to sort of have manageable time frames that allow for, people to have sort of looked at the sort of the decision or recommendation and decided whether they want to call it in, but then that you turn that around as quickly as possible, because the whole
people can use it as a tool to delay things.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, as I say, we're looking to ensure that you don't have that. There's also the issue of how many times a decision could perhaps the same decision could be called in. We're looking at the whole process at this point in time. To ensure that we don't sort of that as we keep saying, striking the balance between providing those protections that the executive and the politicians want to see, but also allowing the business of councils to proceed as effectively as possible, and that services are delivered to their ratepayers.
Yes, as Peter said, if things grind to a halt, then you lose confidence of the public as well, that you're not doing the job.
And that's the reason why we've also included the provision in the bill that allows those percentages to be amended, and that would be a piece of legislation by draft affirmative, so it would need to be debated in plenary of the Assembly before we could change those amendments, those percentages. But it would allow that if it becomes clear, for example, that there is a problem, particularly with QMV, that maybe it's too high a percentage, we can revisit that.
Yeah, it may be particularly difficult for the likes of Belfast City Council with fairly even power distribution, or both sides have more or less equal votes. Yeah. Okay. Any questions? No. Okay. We moved on. The next paper is on ethical standards. Okay, Julie.
We know that a number of issues have been raised about the proposed new ethical standards framework, and in particular the issue of how you would challenge a decision of the Commissioner for Complaints. So we thought it might be helpful if we provided you with some background about what happens in other jurisdictions. Now, the ethical standards frameworks in other jurisdictions, they differ significantly from one another, with different arrangements for investigating and adjudicating on cases, and the procedures for challenging decisions of the adjudication body also differs across the various jurisdictions. In England, the ethical standards framework changed as a result of the Localism Act 2011, and each authority must now adopt its own code and put in place arrangements for investigating allegations and for making decisions on those allegations. And these arrangements must include appointment of an independent person whose views must be sought and taken into account before a decision can be taken. Ethical complaints would be made to a councillor's monitoring officer, who would make initial findings on whether to proceed, and if so, investigate. An investigation can be undertaken by either an officer of the council or by an independent investigator. They will then produce a written report to the monitoring officer, and that will then go to a committee of the local authority. It's usually the Standards Committee or the Audit and Governance Committee of the authority, which is then responsible for setting up a subcommittee to hold a hearing on the matter and to determine the complaint. On hearing all evidence, the committee will consider its decision, determine whether a breach is determined, and the committee must then decide on the appropriate action to take. The action to be taken is not prescribed, and the question of sanctions is open to the lawful discretion of local authorities. The legislation makes no provision to put in place an appeals mechanism against such decisions, but the decision would be challengeable by judicial review. In Wales, the ethical standards procedure is the responsibility of the Public Services Ombudsman for Wales, and cases are either investigated by the Ombudsman or referred to a Council Standards Committee for action or consideration. The Standards Committee will consider case investigation reports by the Ombudsman where the Ombudsman has referred the case to a Standards Committee for determination. It will also consider cases which the Ombudsman has referred to the Council for investigation by the Council Monitoring Officer and adjudication by the Standards Committee, and cases referred to the Council for local resolution. The committee, in assessing any reporting an alleged breach, must decide if the code has been broken, and if so, what penalty would be suitable. In cases which are retained for investigation by the Ombudsman, following that investigation, the Ombudsman will prepare a report for the adjudication panel for Wales. The panel's role is to form case and interim case tribunals to consider whether members of county, county borough and community councils, police, fire and national park authorities in Wales have breached the authority's statutory code of conduct. In those cases where it's the adjudication panel which has looked at the case and which has adjudicated on the case, the person who is subject of the complaint may seek the permission of the High Court to appeal against the decision. In cases where it's an authority standards committee which has adjudicated, a member may appeal against a decision of the committee to the adjudication panel for Wales. And in these appeal cases, a tribunal of the panel will decide whether to uphold or overturn the determination of a standards committee. Where it upholds the decision of a standards committee, it will either endorse the sanction imposed or can refer it back to the committee with a recommendation that a different sanction be imposed, up to a maximum suspension of 6 months. There is no right of appeal against a decision of a tribunal formed to hear an appeal against the decision of a standards committee. In Scotland,
can go for the JR. No?
Yeah.
Well, ultimately,
it's always open to JR.
Yeah.
In Scotland, the Commissioner for Ethical Standards in Public Life in Scotland, which was established in July 2013, is an independent office holder with responsibility for investigating complaints about councillors, MSPs and members of devolved public bodies. If appropriate, the Commissioner will report on the outcome of the investigation to the Standards Commission for Scotland. This is an independent body that works with councils to promote high standards of conduct, issues guidance to councils and makes determinations on a Commissioner's report. The Commission may decide to hold a hearing and direct the Commissioner to carry out further investigations or take no action. Should the Standards Commission decide to hold a hearing, a panel consisting of members of the Commission will determine whether a breach has occurred, and if so, what sanction to apply. And this will include censure, suspension or partial suspension not exceeding 1 year, and disqualification not exceeding 5 years. An appeal against the decision of the Commission is made to the Sheriff Principal. In Ireland, if an ethics register of the local authority becomes aware of a possible breach, they will refer it to the manager and mayor of the local authority, who will consider what action should be taken. That is, whether they should carry out an investigation, whether there should be disciplinary procedures, whether the matter should be referred to the Director of Public Prosecutions, or any other action which they consider appropriate. In cases where there is a perceived conflict of interest, the matter may be referred to the Standards and Public Office Commission, in which case an inquiry officer of the Commission will conduct a preliminary inquiry and report to the Commission with a recommendation. The legislation which sets out the ethical framework deals mainly with declarations of interests, and there is no mandatory code. And to date, there appears to be no evidence of any investigated breaches that have warranted further action, and no information on provision of appeals. So that's really a quick run-through of what happens in other jurisdictions. I mean, it's a variety. In England, it's judicial review. Depending on the adjudication body, really, it's a matter of that's where a challenge will go. If it's a standards committee in Wales, it goes to the adjudication panel for Wales. If it's the adjudication panel in Wales that makes the decision, then it's an appeal to the High Court. And in Scotland, where they have a different court system, it's actually the Sheriff Principal that an appeal can go to. So that's really the issue of who appeals and what challenges there can be in other jurisdictions. We're aware of a couple of other issues that have been raised in relation to ethical standards. One dealing with minor complaints, and that many people have raised the issue that there seems to be no way of dealing with minor complaints of breaches of the code. Under the ethical standards framework provided in the bill, all complaints which are in writing are referred to the Commissioner for Complaints for consideration. And concerns have been raised that, if there's a minor complaint, is it sort of like a, are we, is that far too stringent an issue for minor complaints? The ethical framework would not preclude a council from dealing with minor complaints which have arisen in the council by seeking local resolution or mediation on the issue before it reaches the stage of a written complaint being sent to the Commissioner. And if, for example, an issue arose between two councillors or between a councillor and a council officer, the council could try and deal with the issue in-house before it got to the stage of a written complaint being sent to the Commissioner, but we recognise that there are concerns that there's no formal way of dealing with minor complaints, and we've been researching this issue of how minor complaints are dealt with in other jurisdictions, and we're actually just about to put a paper to the Minister on this issue of possibly providing means of local resolution.
Okay. Even within, I'm sure all councils would have like officers dealing with disciplinary procedure, something kind of similar from there, maybe can step in to look at those issues. There's a complaint of councillors, but with maybe councillors sitting on it as well. Sure. Sorry, Peter.
There is an issue there, and I'll wait to see what comes forward in relation to that. I suppose the issue, to some extent as well, is we don't want to put some of the council officers in a slightly invidious position as well. Whether there's some mechanism which involves maybe a council officer coming from a different area, or something of that nature. I just because I think the problem is, given the fact, and this is one of the reasons why I think one of the things we looked at, sort of a standards committee within the council and always moved away from quite a bit, was you would leave an officer in a situation that they were doing this occasionally as part of their job, and it's very difficult, Chair, if it was a question of an officer who, once every so often, say it was a complaint against yourself, was dealing with you on a particular complaint against you, and then the rest of the week was dealing with you on other issues. And I think that'd be, or alternatively, if you almost have somebody who's ring-fenced that, then it's a question of perhaps somebody almost trying to generate up work for themselves. So there is an issue in that. But just from the point of view of the department,
complaints committee, small complaints committee of councillors.
But again, and I know that there's been some concerns at times raised. I mean, do you then have a situation from a complaints committee of somebody then either being accused of degree of bias or enmity in terms of ruling against a particular councillor, either from their party or from outside their party, and how satisfactory that is would be questionable. But I mean, obviously there's further work clearly going to be done. Just in terms of the appeals mechanism side of it, I mean, I would say I think that it is something that we do need, and if it doesn't come to the department, I suspect the committee or some of the parties may need to. I mean, there seems to be a broad consensus out there, judging from different parties' reactions, judging from council's reactions, that simply, for instance, that the only real appeal mechanism is ultimately by way of judicial review isn't regarded as being satisfactory, and there needs to be a formal appeals mechanism built in on essentially the merits of the case. Particularly, you can get a situation with the best will in the world. Something can be done procedurally correct, but the wrong result is got, and that councillor may then find themselves being barred for 5 years from council. Now, they might even take a judicial review. They might win the judicial review. They may find in the meantime that somebody else is in their seat, that indeed the elections have taken place, their reputations through the mud, and perhaps even to pay for the thing, even if they've won it, they may be ending up with a very large legal bill. So I think there does seem to be, from what I'm detecting of people, a broad consensus that there needs to be an appeal mechanism built into this legislation, which is at a level below judicial review. And whatever mechanism, where that appeal goes to, I don't know, but I think something has to be found now. I certainly urge the department really to come back with something of that nature, because I suspect if the department doesn't, then the rest of us are going to have to put something in the legislation ourselves in that regard.
He did say that in his presentation to us. Either way, it's going to be very expensive for anybody to bring in an appeal after he's made the decision, because you still need legal representation.
It depends precisely what way the thing is put. By the same token, if you have, within any situation, a broad appeal mechanism, and whether that is going to, say it's like a local government audit or whatever it happens to be, and you have some sort of thing, that at least, I think, first of all, from a timing point of view, should be preferable to a judicial review. And the problem is that even leaving aside the fact that judicial review is more expensive, will be longer in its nature, the problem with judicial review is the grounds for judicial review are limited. You have to show not that the decision was wrong, but either that it was procedurally wrong, or alternatively that it was so unreasonable that no basically right-thinking person could come to that. Now, the problem on that is you can get situations where somebody, a councillor, could well be in the right, has been wrongly convicted, if you like, via this process. But, you know, it's not so absurd that nobody in their right mind could have come to that verdict. And I think you're putting a bar in by way of a judicial review which is so high for people and so long, so cumbersome. I think you will need some sort of mechanism in between that.
But I think Tom was also saying this is the way we are dealing with complaints.
Well, with respect, I don't take, and I appreciate I wasn't here for all of what Tom Foley said. I don't take his position as gospel on this. And looking at it, I mean, I suppose most of us around this table are from our experience in local government, have been former councillors, and I think, from the point of view of a councillor's point of view, to be in a situation of the assurances that Tom Frawley gave us is not going to be a great deal of comfort to people, to be honest. And I think people want to have a situation where they can have some level of justice. Because, you know, this is, you know, it's one thing if somebody could investigate it and said, well, maybe you said something you shouldn't have said, you know, we ask you to issue an apology, that's one thing. But you could be talking about essentially people's careers in connection with this. You can be talking about people whose names can be dragged through the mud, and not everybody who is making...
Is there a system here, though? Is there not?
As?
For complaints of MLAs. So we have the Assembly Ombudsman. He makes a judgment.
And
the only way
I might be wrong in this, but I'm not sure in terms of the powers of an Assembly Ombudsman. And you could make a complaint against a department, you can make a complaint against an individual.
If he makes a judgment, then
well,
that's
if
the end
you
of
could
it.
name me, but with respect on it, I'm not sure the Ombudsman, for example, has a power to bar somebody from being an MLA. To actually say that they are suspended as an MLA or they are actually removed as an MLA. And actually given a part, you know, and from that point of view, that is where there's a qualitative difference. And where you have a situation with the best will in the world, where somebody then, and ultimately in terms of Ombudsman report, it then goes to the Standards and Privileges Committee, which accepts or doesn't accept the thing. You know, somebody who is barred from council, and particularly if they're barred because there is some serious allegation that's made against them, I think that they have a right beyond simply judicial review to have some level of appeal. That person's life, certainly their political career, could effectively ruin, and that isn't really the situation as regards an MLA. An MLA might get a degree of slap on the wrist on it. They are not going to be disqualified from the Assembly. That's never happened in relation to, and I think that there needs to be something more robust. And I think it's all very well if you're Tom Frawley or anybody else saying, well, actually, we've a system we're reasonably happy with. To be fair, Tom Frawley's not going to be on the receiving end of this, from that point of view. And sometimes, again, with experience of people on it, sometimes complaints are very genuine.
Been in the job for a long time.
Well,
yes.
Yeah, but with the greatest degree of respect on it, he is the one holding the gun rather than the one facing the gun, if I can use that analogy on it. And, you know, the reality is there are sometimes complaints are very justifiable and very genuine. There are also times people get a very bullheaded attitude to things and are completely irrational in relation to it. And that's not to say that somebody won't then suffer an injustice as a result of that. And, you know, I'm certainly detecting from virtually all the submissions we got in relation to that, from anybody involved in the local government sphere, and they want to see an appeal mechanism built in and something which isn't just simply a judicial review.
And how can that be managed, Julie?
Well, I mean, we have heard all of the evidence, obviously, people have given to the committee, and that's something which we need to go back to the Minister on, about that issue.
Yeah. Certainly Tom Frawley's point is that this is the way we've been dealing with complaints to public bodies and public representatives. If we make an exception here with local councillors, then it may just turn the system, paraphrasing, turn the system upside down. Then we need to provide further abuse mechanisms for other complainants.
Maybe the system does need turned on its head, because if there's a situation where potentially people are getting complained about and they don't realistically have any proper right of appeal, then actually that is something which I think is wrong. Maybe it's actually the fact that if we're making changes here, that might mean in other cases you may have to look at appeal mechanisms of some description that actually may show that actually the whole thing is actually a bit out of step in that regard. But
Well, I'm not holding against, equality and fairness. If we do need to build in that appeal system, then, we'll look at it. But I'm just, reminding members, this is what Tom Frawley said in his presentation. Okay, members, we moved on. Next one's on community planning. Big one. Yeah.
With particular reference to the duty on statutory bodies and the departments. If I look at the statutory, the duty on the statutory bodies, first of all, as an overview, I can say that the department fully recognise the sort of statutory bodies and the departments need to be sort of tied in to the community planning framework, because they are responsible. Statutory bodies are responsible for delivering a range of services in the council district, and departments are either delivering services or are setting the policies for the delivery of certain services. When we look at the duty on the statutory bodies, we have sort of included a provision in the bill that is sort of comparable with the provision in Wales, which is placing a duty on statutory bodies to be every community planning partner of a local authority must participate in community planning for the authority's area to the extent that such planning is connected with the partner's functions, which is natural and sensible, and must assist the authority in the discharge of its duties under that sort of provision. The legislation in Wales also goes on to say that for the purposes of the provision, a reference to an action to be performed or function to be exercised by a local authority or one of its community planning partners is a reference to an action or function within the powers of the authority or partners. In other words, it's tying the sort of statutory bodies in. They must participate and take actions, but it can only act on those areas that it has legal responsibility to act on.
The voluntary sector thing, the bill, on the face of the language is not strong enough. Kind of seek to promote rather than they must do.
Yeah, it's something we can, I think we can investigate. But it's also stronger than the provision in Scotland, where in Scotland it is simply specified it is a duty of the bodies, office holders and other persons specified to assist the local authority in the discharge of its duties under the section. So it's as you can see, it's sort of a bit weak. It's weaker. In England, there's absolutely no duty placed on statutory bodies. In England, sort of community planning or community strategies, as it is in the Local Government Act 2000, simply requires a local authority to prepare a community strategy for promoting or improving the economic, social and environmental well-being of their area, and contributing to the achievement of sustainable development in the United Kingdom. So it doesn't go beyond that. And certainly, the view would be that the legislative framework will be supported by statutory guidance that the department will develop in collaboration with local government and the other departments and statutory bodies, so we can ensure that the framework that is supported adequately. But there's a point that I want to come on to subsequently, in terms of, after I've talked about this, because it covers both the statutory bodies and the departments. In terms of the duty in the departments, we've actually gone further than any of the other jurisdictions, because in the other jurisdictions, the duty is simply on relevant ministers to, so far as is reasonably practicable to do so, in exercising their functions, aim to promote and encourage community planning. And that's where it goes in Scotland. We've actually gone that one step further by saying that departments have to have regard to any implications of a community plan for the exercise of that department's functions. I caught a bit earlier on, in terms of the evidence from the researcher. The bill places the duty on departments because in Northern Ireland the responsibilities are vested in departments rather than in ministers, which is the case, whereas in England and Scotland and Wales the authority is vested in the relevant minister, and so that's where the difference comes there. But I think underpinning both of those duties is trying to tie them in, but it also recognises that, the different accountability arrangements that, the statutory bodies are responsible and accountable to their boards of directors, and ultimately to, the department and the minister that established them. And equally, in terms of the departments are accountable, as officials to their ministers, and through their ministers to the Assembly. So, it's trying to, again, strike the balance of ensuring that you have that framework there to have those bodies involved, but recognising that, they have separate accountability mechanisms and maybe won't always be able to do what a council wants it to do. And there is that tension, I suppose, within that.
I think that's the major concern expressed by Neogura councils, community places, that community planning is a great concept, great idea if it works, but you need people to buy in, particularly the departments, the statutory agencies to buy in, to align, like Peter and McNally said again this morning. It's aligning the departmental policies with the community plans and putting in the resources from the departments to make it work. If not, it's just going to be a talking shop. As I said before, I was on South Belfast neighbourhood renewal partnership. Then you only get DSD staff to say yes, and then you're getting very junior level staff coming in from the Department of Health, from the Department of Education, who sat there throughout the meetings, not said a word, not commit to anything. Yeah.
I appreciate that issue. As I say, I think community planning is about building those relationships between the various partners, and the various partners recognising how community planning can assist them all in delivering their desired outcomes and benefits. And I know that.
How can the bill strengthen this word to try to make the departments more committed to the community plan? Are you minded to do that?
Well, I think this is again something that the Minister would have to look at, and indeed the wider executive, because as has already been pointed out, there is a need clearly to align local need with regional policy and regional service provision. But there's also clearly, departments need to align what they're doing with the programme for government, which is the accountability framework that is set for departments. And I think, in my conversations with local government, I think at times local government believe that community planning is a vehicle through which it can call central government to account. And I think that is going too far, because central government is accountable through its minister to the executive and the assembly, and that is the accountability mechanism. However, as John's pointed out, I think community planning will work when it is clearly articulated how actions at local level can contribute to and help departments or agencies to meet what are their programme for government targets. And I think that is a process that is going to take some time to bed in, because clearly, in 2015, when councils get their full community planning responsibilities, there's going to be a lot of work required to identify what local need means and what local need is, and then to work together with a top-down and bottom-up approach so that everything starts to align. And I think that's one of the key pieces of work that the partnership panel is going to have to get its head around in the very early days, to get that agreement between central and local government about who is responsible for what and how that joint relationship will start to develop and to actually deliver in a way that is better for the citizen on the ground, and in a way that actually maximises the use of public sector money, which is what this is all about.
Yeah.
But I think it's a very exciting area, but I think it's also a very challenging area, and it will take a bit of time, I think, to bed and get right. As we've seen when you look to Scotland, where it did take some time to bed in and actually start to produce results.
Well, you can see, they are reviewing the whole system, community planning now. They're putting in, the statement of ambition and all the single agreements. And
I think it's easier to do that in Scotland, where local government actually has responsibility for a much wider range of key services. And although councils will be clearly getting more powers and more services to deliver under this reform programme, they still won't have the full range of powers, for example, that councils will have in Scotland. And that's all the more reason to make sure that this partnership starts to gel, all the better.
Well, that's why NEOCA is concerned that you may be raising false hopes, false expectations of what community planning can do and will do. That's dilemma there too. Okay, questions? Any? No. We then moved on to the next item.
Performance improvement.
Yeah.
This actually flows quite neatly from community planning, because, as the Chief Executive of Belfast City Council so eloquently put it, there is a clear alignment between the outworkings of community planning and performance improvement in local government. And again, we're aware of some of the comments that have been made about the performance framework and the view that this is top-down, top-heavy, central government dictating to local government how it looks at its performance improvement. And I suppose, again, taking you through the rationale for the framework as it's proposed in the bill, that was all worked through the Policy Development Panel and agreed by the Strategic Leadership Board. And at that time, the agreement was that the new framework would comprise of the following elements. So there would be an updated statement of a council's duty to secure continuous improvement in the delivery of its services, the establishment of a regime of performance indicators and standards, and there would be also regional indicators agreed through the partnership panel. Councils would prepare and publish a corporate plan that also includes an improvement plan. Appropriate monitoring and support mechanisms should be in place to provide accountability, and that a facility for external assurance of the Council's improvement plan should be provided. And so, following endorsement by the Strategic Leadership Board, the Department then looked at ways in which this external assurance could be provided, and a number of models were considered. So, the outworkings of all of that are in Part 12 of the bill, and Part 12 of the bill actually looks at performance improvement and the framework at two separate levels, local government level and central government level. And there's a provision there for a clear role for councillors themselves and councils in setting their own performance targets and indicators against which they want to assess themselves. So there's a level of self-determination in terms of the improvement measures that local government wants to set for itself. The bill also wouldn't preclude the sector, if it so wished, to set regional targets for itself. And that may be something that local government might wish to consider, for example, as a further outworking of the ICE programme, the Improvement, Collaboration and Efficiency, where they are looking to drive out improvement at a regional level. So I think that's an interesting area where local government could explore for itself. There is also provision for the Department acting on behalf of other executive departments, and particularly those that are transferring functions to councils or have placed duties onto councils to perform specific services. There's a provision for them to specify performance indicators and standards of a regional nature. And that's required because whilst functions and services are being transferred or powers conferred to local government, clearly the policy responsibility still remains with departments. And departments and their ministers will need, as indeed the Assembly will need, some sort of assurance that policies set at regional level are being effectively delivered at local level. And that's the case particularly where policies have programme for government targets attached to them. because there does need to be a mechanism to determine that local government is delivering against those targets. So that's why there is this provision in the bill for targets to be set centrally. In terms of the role then of the local government auditor, I want to make a statement at the beginning, really, to set this. Sorry.
About the improvement framework.
Yes.
I mean, the councillors are concerned about the proposal that different departments can give them, inspections and targets to set. I mean, how do you really alleviate their concern that there's going to be really just micromanagement of from departments?
I think that the targets and the framework and the measures set by central government, there does need to be a coordination of those. We've listened to experience in Scotland where I think in the early days councils, both through a mixture of targets set by central government and those set by local government itself, had over 600 targets to meet. And we certainly would not want to see that sort of a situation develop. So I think that is, again, something that the partnership panel will have to get to grips with quite quickly when it's set up. How do we coordinate the sets of targets and make those manageable? They'll be fairly high level. And focused on the key issues that departments feel that they need delivered to meet their obligations in terms of the area or the department that is responsible for setting the policy for these issues. So there will have to be a lot of work done, and in consultation with agreement with local government, and that's a role for the partnership panel. Okay. So in terms of the role of the local government auditor, the scope of this bill is not intended to provide a root and branch review of the local government audit arrangements in general, but they are there to provide for some amendments that are required in relation to local government reform and the new responsibilities that councils are going to have. And it may be helpful if I explain the current relationship between the department, the local government auditor, and local government itself, because it's not the same relationship that, for example, the Northern Ireland Office and the Controller and Auditor General has with departments, where it's responsible and answerable to the Assembly through the Public Accounts Committee. The duties placed on the local government auditor are in the context of the department, the DOE, having the statutory responsibilities for the provision and oversight of local government functions, including the provision of the local government audit function. And in 1972, the Local Government Act made a provision for the Department of the Environment to appoint local government auditors to audit the accounts of local government bodies. And indeed, in those days, the people appointed were employees of the department. That process, however, evolved, and in 2003, there was further legislation made, the Audit and Accountability Northern Ireland Audit Order, where the present arrangements were put in place, whereby the services for local government audit are provided by staff employed by the Northern Ireland Audit Office and designated to perform local government audit functions by the department. That was further amended in 2005 by the Local Government Order 2005, but that did not alter the department's statutory responsibility for designating local government auditors. So, whilst the transfer to the Controller and Auditor General resulted in the Controller and Auditor General having a more direct responsibility for the provision of staff to deliver Local Government Audit Services, the Department of the Environment, on behalf of the Executive, remains legally responsible for designating members of the CNAG staff to support the Department in its responsibility for ensuring that local government's financial responsibilities are exercised properly. So the local government auditor function is distinct and separate from those of the Controller and Auditor General and the Northern Ireland Audit Office. So whilst the Northern Ireland Audit Office reports to the Assembly for its role in auditing central government, the same relationship doesn't apply for its role in terms of supporting and providing the audit provision for local government. The Department's power of direction in relation to requiring the local government auditor to undertake an audit investigation or inspection in respect of bodies for which it has a legitimate and statutory interest does not compromise the independence of the local government auditor in conducting individual audit investigations and inspections, because clearly those remain at all times under the control of the local government auditor and her staff in line with standards set out in the Financial Reporting Council. The conduct of the requested audit or inspection and the results and conclusions are a matter for the local government auditor. And then finally, in relation to clause 97, which I know has been discussed today, this is the issue about the local government auditor having to assess in advance whether the council has arrangements in place to meet the statutory requirements. It is about whether they have the arrangements in place. And it's not designed to ask the local government auditor to directly determine at that stage whether they're going to meet their performance improvements targets. So, this issue about having some sort of crystal ball gazing, it's not the intention of that. And maybe there's a bit of wording that we may need to look at to clarify that. But it is to make sure that the appropriate arrangements are in place. Not whether or not the performance plan is going to be met.
Okay. And also, what about resourcing? That's an issue that's been repeated over and over again, because they now have the additional role of monitoring improvement.
Yes.
So, is there going to be extra resourcing for the auditors?
Well, at present, the local government auditor invoices local government for the services that it provides. So clearly, if there is additional service provision, that would need to be paid for. I suppose the issue in terms of cost is, cheaper is not always better, and you have to balance the additional cost against the improvements and the cost effectiveness of those improvements. So that the cost would need to be looked in the round in terms of both what it costs to do the audit, but then the outcomes of the improvement plans and the potential for cost savings as a result.
Another issue Louise Mason also mentioned is that the auditing of councils should be targeted rather than doing all councils every year.
Yes.
I mean, is it going to be allowed?
Well, in terms of performance improvement, I mean, certainly we've heard the comments from the local government auditor and the potential or the proposal that a risk-based approach might be taken. I suppose in terms of taking a risk-based approach, you would probably need to do some baselining. And I mean, I think that the proposal that these performance improvement audits should be done every year, at the time, those were based on the principle that you would need to do them every year, at least at the beginning, until things settle down. Now, maybe at a future date, there may be a way of looking at amending that, but in the initial stage at least the proposal was that each of these audits would be done each year, and if that is to be proposed as an amendment, that would be a policy change that we'd need to take back to the Minister and the Executive.
To allow this to be reviewed?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or an amendment made to the bill. That would be a distinct policy change.
Because it does make sense when you think all the 11 new councils, maybe just 1 or 2 or 3 only need to be checked all the time, whereas rest, you're going to get the same old report every year. It's just a waste of resources. Yeah. But you need to benchmark it, and I know
I think
what
it's
you mean.
the benchmarking and baselining it in the initial stages.
Okay,
Yeah.
Any questions on this last paper?
Oh.
Okay. Sorry, was that one? Should I? Yes, this new term that we've never heard of before, the super affirmative procedure. So this is from the examiner of rules.
Yes.
So is it going to be kind of difficult?
Well, of course, we'll have to get the minister's view on it, but we actually have discovered a piece of legislation where a similar sort of procedure was used before, which was the 2002 Local Government Best Value Act, is it? We'll be able to send you that, where there is a form of what looks like a super affirmative procedure. So we're looking into that at the minute.
Would you need to do any amendment in the bill to say this has to be?
Yes.
Well, you will have to, as in at the moment it's negative procedure.
Yes.
So it's not only affirmative
well,
procedure, it's
at the
super
minute-
affirmative procedure.
At the minute, it's affirmative procedure, I think, but they're suggesting that there needs to be this additional level of.
Yes, just add an extra layer, extra level, really.
I think it's an additional consultation.
Consultation,
level
yes, a
that's
big
to be-
consultation. Then
that's
you have
being
the draft
suggested.
order, and then you have then the
Yes.
proper draft order.
But we are
No,
looking-
final draft order.
But we are looking at that.
Okay, okay. No questions on this, members? Okay, well, thanks very much indeed, and you're coming back next week?
Yes.
Yes, lovely, yeah. We'll have permanent seats for you here in future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Members, okay. Any other issues, any other information, members, you may want to give for Susie? Susie's going back to look at legal advice on the...
No, we request
we requested it. Okay, well, so she's coming back with it. And then, really, members, I suppose, this, well, the Belfast City Council, at their request, we granted them the presentation. I suppose, members, are you content? That was our last presentation on this draft bill. You don't want to hear any more presentation from anybody? I can see from the faces. I can see from the faces. Yeah, clearly no.
Could we have it today?
Sorry?
If we're having a presentation, could we have it today?
Well, this is our bus one. Our SPP is waiting for us to do the photo shoot as well. So, members, okay, we're saying we have enough, we've done enough receiving evidence. So, from next week, then we're really going into the informal clause by clause. Okay, with departmental officials. Okay, quickly, correspondence, members, at page 452. That's a letter from Castlereagh Borough Council regarding the proposed Sainsbury's store, and it's really our policy not to look at individual planning application. Members, would you be content if we forward this to the department to deal with? Yeah. Okay. Then next item is at 455. That's an anonymous letter regarding alleged fraudulent activity in planning services. Not quite fraudulent, it's more about people working being allowed to work at home. I think it is also our policy. Yeah,
what
it's
is,
also.
What is the policy? I know it says that suggested action to send to public accounts committee. What is the policy in dealing with anonymous letters? And
We don't usually accept anonymous complaint anyway, for a start. Yes. Number two is, in my view, is the management issue for the planning service. It's not up to us to interfere.
So we don't send it to the public accounts
So
committee?
no.
We do?
Yes. So we're going to send it to PAC for them to look at.
Why?
They deal with complaints about management or
possible fraudulent activity in public service.
There's surely a difference, with the best will in the world, not massively strong views one, but surely there's a difference between somebody writes into us, makes a complaint, it's our duty to forward that on, from somebody simply sends something in anonymously. Now, I think if somebody's to be stood over, it's actually somebody's actually got to have a name on it and some level of, you know, accountability.
They're actually a hard-working taxpayer.
Yeah, well, that may narrow it down, but even so, I'm just conscious of the fact that, I mean, I'm sure we'll all at various levels sometimes have things that maybe, say, a phone call is made to us. I'm not saying necessarily in relation to this on it, but sometimes people have a complaint and they refuse to give a name or whatever, and, you know, I'm not overly comfortable with indulging people who, at the end of the day, are simply going to be anonymous in their nature and that sort of.
The Public Accounts Committee would make a judgment on that if they felt there was a wider issue that needed to be followed up, maybe with the Audit Office or so forth. They might well take the same view as you, Peter.
But I think we may be failing in our duties not to forward it on to PAC.
Well, that was a sort of agreed procedure within the Assembly. Any committee that gets a whistleblowing type letter, we pass it to them. They make the judgment on it.
Okay, members. Next one is at page 456. And this correspondence from the Regional Development Committee regarding their inquiry into benefits of cycling to the Northern Ireland economy. Certainly we welcome that. I welcome that very much. So they want to ask us if we have any comments on the terms of reference at page 457. So members, any comment on this, or we just say go ahead, great, support you? Okay, carry on. Yeah, maybe one bit is about road safety. Are they looking into road safety for cyclists? I'm sure they would. I think they look at the effectiveness and all that.
No, it's just that there's an overlap between what they're doing and our remit, and they're just asking if it's all right, if the committee's happy with it.
Certainly. Okay, members. Next item, 459, letter from Can Valley resident regarding planning application. Again, is an individual planning application. If we just forward it to the department. Okay, members. Next item is page 465. This is a request from NITRA, Northern Ireland Retail Trade Association, Retail Trade Association, something like that. They ask members if we are content for the chairperson, for me, to meet with NITRA to discuss their manifesto for the forthcoming local government elections. I am a bit uncomfortable with this, members, really. Why?
I think with that, it's probably, I mean, maybe we might have to, as a committee, to decline that, because I don't think it's really the committee's responsibility to discuss something. If individuals or individual parties, and I'm sure they will meet a lot of different groups in terms of that, but I think in a capacity as a committee, I'm not saying
really. Okay, that's my view too, really. So we're happy with that, to write to them if they want to approach. Individual parties, it's up to them, but not meeting with the committee. Okay. Next one is at page 466, a letter from Social Development Committee regarding terms of reference of the wind inquiry. Members, so can we just send this letter to ETI Committee, which really has just started the inquiry into energy prices? This is about energy prices, and will members be content with that? We just followed it on. So the rest just letters to note. Members, are you happy with that? Okay. Then forward work programme is at page 497. Okay, members, content to note? AOB, any AOBs? No. Okay, then next meeting, usual time, next Thursday, Senate Chamber. And thank you very much for your patience. I think it's been a very useful meeting. We'll go now. We better go. Yes.